Oh, wow. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you guys being here, especially if you're here in the live chat. Thank you for being here right on time. So we're gonna basically get into and continue reviewing for educational purposes, fair use. A book we've been reviewing, going over. Um, kind of highlighting a lot of the history we know about the so-called crypto, Sephardic Jews, Moorish Muslims, Moriscos, conversos, New Christians, secret Jews, a lot of terms. So-called Dutch, so-called Huguenots, Protestants, there's so many. So-called merchants. Yeah. So we've been reviewing a pretty good book lately. So actually last time we reviewed it was in January. So I wanted to get back into it. Man, time be flying when we are having so much fun learning, right? Time be flying. And I'd be like, oh yeah, got to get back into that research and history, right? That's what we do here. We talk about history, right? So I appreciate everybody coming through. Thank you. Pura vida, like and share. We're gonna get started right away. First of all, I want to remind you of the other ones, the previous readings we've done. And now I put it all in a playlist. All right, guys, I put it in a playlist. If you don't know what that means, I mean, I put all the videos related to this review we're doing, this book. And, again, before we started reading this, we already had this whole history already from our individual investigation through many different sources, right? But if you missed the previous reviews for discussion and commentary and education of this book, here are the videos right here. You can just go to my playlist tab and look for the one called Atlantic Diasporas of the Jews, conversos, crypto Jews, in the age of mercantilism. Well, you guys will see it, right? So again, today we're gonna do like the fourth part. All right. Wow. Wow. So the whole time you guys didn't hear me? My fault. My fault. Okay. Thank you guys for letting me know. So again, we're in chapter 4 of this book. I showed you guys the book. I don't know how much I got to. I guess I'll just read it all again. On March 13th, 1656, right? So disclaimer, right? If you guys are wondering why we have people of color on the thumbnails, watch at least part 1 of this or catch up on the videos. It's been 8 years of research, all right? So my mic is back, right, guys? You guys can hear me now? I think Carmen's a little behind, but it's okay. So it says on March 13th, 1656, A lowly but self-important scrivener and public notary by the name of Francis Knevet or Nevet sent for John Baptiste Dunnington, bookkeeper and clerk to the Canaries, merchant Antonio Rodriguez Robles, and prevailed upon young Dunnington to swear out a deposition concerning recently imported Spanish goods and monies in his master's possession. On the basis of this denunciation, an order was issued for the seizure of 2 ships belonging to Robles, along with letters, papers, and the sum of 40,000 Spanish ducats, to be found in Robles' home. Knevet thus set in motion the wheels of a prosecution under the aegis of a general order of the Lord Protector that allowed for the seizure of Spanish goods now that England and Spain were at war. So-called England versus so-called Spain, right? It's like a religious thing going on always, you know. Having been caught red-handed with both Spanish goods and Spanish specie, Robles was hard-pressed to prove that he was neither a Spaniard nor an agent of the Spanish crown. This was to prove a most problematic task, for Robles had given evidence in Spanish in a case on the Spanish wool trade just 3 years before. Thus, he was already recorded in the London port books as having been a resident of Madrid at the time of the trial. It was now alleged that he had approached a number of persons to prevaricate on his behalf in the instant prosecution. He first tried to inveigle a servant to say, if questioned on the matter, that he was Portuguese. This attempt was said to have failed. However, when the boy replied he could not lie, for he, Robles, was a Spaniard, to the protest from Robles that he was married to a woman of Portugal, the boy replied, that makes no Portugal. Robles then attempted to put forward his claim of Portuguese nationality through Dunnington, but Dunnington told the authorities that he had no personal knowledge of his master's nationality, only that he had heard he is lately turned a Jew, having formerly professed himself a Catholic, and that he, Robles, was generally reputed a Portugal, having kindred that are Portugals and the Canaries and Holland. All right, Holland, remember Holland was where the Sephardic Jews and Moors, a lot of them fled to. During the Inquisition, when the Catholics were going after these people, they ended up in Holland, Netherlands, and they created their new Jerusalem in Amsterdam. That was their new Jerusalem. Dunnington reported that he had traveled with Robles on trading sojourns of several months each to the Canaries, Holland, and Antwerp, right? But this evidence provided no conclusive proof of his nationality. That same day, Domingo de la Cerda, a relation of Robles, testified that he himself was a Jew born in Spain to converso parents, so people who converted so they wouldn't get kicked out or killed, right? That's what was going on during the Inquisition. So his parents were conversos, people who converted from either Sephardic Jews or Muslim Moors into Christians or Catholics. And they had fled, he's saying, these parents who were converso parents who fled from the Inquisition into Portugal, but that he could not testify to a certainty as to the nationality of Robles. The matter was further confused when Robles testified on his own behalf, for he both claimed to be a Jew and admitted that he is not yet circumcised. The prosecution of this case consumed the better part of 2 months and resulted in a seemingly endless sequence of letters, petitions, depositions, and eyewitnesses' testimony. Even the Commission for the Admiralty and Navy was unable to reach a firm conclusion about Robles, stating they do not find any convicting evidence to clear up either the nation or religion of the Petit Conner. Specifically, the King of Privy Council could be prevailed upon to intervene. Sorry, let me make sure I read everything. That last page. Okay, I didn't, my fault. We might read this investigation as a quest to define the boundaries of English national identity at a temporal moment when the power of English crown to command allegiance was ebbing and at its weakest. Or following Haim Baynard and David S. Katz, we could read it as yet in another example of the requisite but deceitful posing of those forced by circumstance into the double life of the secret Jew, crypto Jews. And again, most of these are people of color, guys. It was indeed a complicated matter, which opens itself to both types of readings. However, I would like to suggest a third alternative, that we mark the case as the opening gambit in a struggle over economic privilege, specifically over the right to participate in developing markets that were beginning to focus ever more seriously on transatlantic exchange. In this scenario, the rules for determining the subject's true allegiance and his claim to belong, indeed, the very nature of his subjecthood, became the means of demarcating economic turf. Those who found themselves unable to prove their allegiance to this satisfaction of local authorities were economically disenfranchised. You see that? Disenfranchised, just like what happened to American Indians and black folks. Hello, black folks in America? Didn't we just read this yesterday? Unless, sorry. Oh, sorry about that, guys. Unless loftier powers in the hierarchy of governance, specifically the king of privy council, could be prevailed upon to intervene. People getting disenfranchised, huh? How then did Jewish merchants conduct effective trading operations within the broader scheme of British transatlantic trade? In this chapter, I examine a number of Jewish traders of the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries who operated more or less legally in Britain and its colonies. In the interstices of these tales, we will find, I think, some significant clues as to the interplay of British regulation, the refinement of transatlantic consumer culture, and economic opportunism. Although each merchant had a different vision for how to succeed in an adverse environment, collectively their stories tell us something about Jewish agency and the process of adapting the available opportunities to the rhythms of a broader British Atlantic economy, so-called British. If, as David Cass suggests, it was the Robles case that finally exposed England's nascent Jewish community to open scrutiny, it did no more than denominate as specifically Jewish activities that had already been going on for some time. Converso merchants, who's the merchants? Converso merchants had been operating in London with official connivance of the crown since the reign of Henry VIII. That's a long time. Antonio Fernandez Carvajal is a case in point, establishing himself in London sometime in the mid-1630s. Carvajal was well known and well respected in London's burgeoning mercantile circles by the early 1640s for his success in the Canary Islands trade. Thus, when one William Sherman denounced him as a recusant of the Church of England in 1645, it was Sherman and not Carvajal who was summoned to the House of Lords to explain what the Lords could only interpret as an action calculated to violate the peace and therefore disrupt the profitable Spanish trade. Significantly, Carvajal ingratiated himself with the growing Puritan ascendancy. Look, who's the Puritans, guys? This is what I'm saying. This guy's a crypto Jew. Listen. Now he's almost becoming a Puritan. During the 1640s, by lending monies to the Parliament in the furtherance of English trade, providing intelligence, all right, that's spy, and importing great store of plate and bullion to this city, to a sufficient extent that in 1650 the Privy Council issued an order that he shall not be molested in his trade exchange or traffic, or have any of his goods seized by virtue of warrant given out from this council against Portuguese property. All right. He was there, like this is their business partner. He was protected. So I guess he got caught, right? And then he got exposed who he was and their involvement, right? Yet it was only after the founding of the Commonwealth government under Cromwell's rule that conditions seemed ripe for well-established conversos to attempt the public revelation of their underlying Jewish identity. All right, that's a big one right there. Why do I say that, guys? Let's see, for all the real people who's been studying hard and understanding what we've been learning over the years about Cromwell, who he represented and who he fought against, right? So again, I'm gonna go over it. Now remember, guys, Cromwell, Protestant, right? Protestant versus the Catholics, right? Again, it's a religions thing. A lot of these Protestants, including probably Cromwell, and a lot of these people are probably somewhat in some way they have relations with Sephardic Jews and Moors or something like that. But we know like John Calvin is crypto Jew, all these people are so-called Protestants. So it makes sense right here. This is what I'm saying. This is big. It's letting you know, this is corroboration. It's telling you that under Cromwell's rule, right? Because he was cool with the Sephardic Jews and Moors. He was against the Catholics, just like them. That conditions seemed ripe for well-established conversos, crypto Jews, to attempt the public revelation of their underlying Jewish identity. They got to openly say, yeah, I'm Sephardic Jewish. They didn't have to hide and say, no, I'm just English, or I'm just Dutch, I'm just French, I'm just a Huguenot, I'm just Protestant, I'm just Christian. Now they can openly say, yeah, I'm so-called Jewish, right? In Cromwell's rule, it's okay because they're the same peoples. After 1655, with his Indianization, naturalization, and with public reports on the Whitehall Conference on the proposal for readmission of the Jews, Carvajal, by virtue of his prominence, provided the most obvious example in the public eye of Jewish hypocrisy. As John Bland described it, Carvajal had basically taken advantage of England's tolerant ambience by revealing his true identity as a Jew only after 20 years living in England. After 20 years, nobody, that was a secret. That was a secret, guys. Enjoying all privileges and quietness among us, being received as a citizen in this city of London, trading freely without the least molestation. As Bland saw it, Carvajal had waited for only a fit time to discover a seeming consent of the readmission of the Jews before acknowledging the truth. Now he wrote, this Fernandez Carvajal, a plain downright Jew, acknowledging that he never was or would be a Christian, taking upon him the outward profession of Christianity only for safety. Again, only for safety. I told you guys, a lot of them, they just did it just to survive. Okay, which now he needed no longer to make use of, being he could live in England as a professed Jew and receive more respect with OP, example Cromwell, or his council in all businesses, either for himself or his tribe, than any Christian could have whatsoever. Indeed, Carvajal played a clever game, one in which his connections in government played a central role. When war broke out with Spain in 1656, Carvajal plied his connections to Cromwell in search of a way to protect his property in the Canaries. With Cromwell's connivance, Carvajal chartered an English ship, so-called English, like I told you guys, so-called English. Who are the captains? He's a Sephardic Jew. but he's coming from England. So when he goes into history, they tell us, oh, this Englishman, this English ship came, and I told you guys, so-called English, so-called Dutch. This is what I mean. Who was really navigating the ships? It was them who had the knowledge, them who had the routes and the connections to all the other ports. The port Jews, remember, they had a whole commerce going on. They had it all on lock, a monopoly. So he was captaining this ship, right? Chartered an English ship at Dover, renamed it the Irish Merchant. Look, he called it the Irish Merchant. Manned it with a crew of Dutch sailors. Again, here we go. Dutch sailors, so-called Dutch. Who are all these people? Are they literally like ancient Irish and ancient Dutch people? Or are they common? Are they crypto Jews, crypto Muslims? Now they're just so-called Irish now, because you see, he just named it Irish and Dutch, and sent it to the Canaries to be loaded with Spanish goods under cover of bills of lading, naming two Dutch merchants based in Amsterdam. Wow, that's like mafia stuff right here, right? This is organized crime right here. In fact, the ship returned directly to London. It was indeed no accident that the first of the series of laws intended to regulate commerce between England and its colonial possessions, the so-called Navigation Acts, took effect. At the same moment, the readmission of the Jews had become a matter of such serious discussion. The mercantile machinations that Carvajal and his companions adopted for the purpose of deflecting the suspicion of Spanish authorities had the unintended, if not entirely unwelcome, consequence of creating confusion among officials at English ports, and result was utter chaos when it came to the collection of the royal customs. It should hardly surprise us to find that the cargo of the Irish merchant was condemned on the libel of an English informer after the ship reached port in July 1656. Nor was this the first or the last time that Carvajal attempted the technique of shipping goods to and from Spain in a nominally non-English ship. In 1639, Carvajal had used a Scottish ship, the Margaret, you see? So now you see what's going on. This is what I'm saying, guys. Who was really captaining, navigating these ships? I told you. We got this one guy pretending to be Irish, right? And now we got another one. Now he had, before that, a Scottish ship named the Margaret, who people assume is just so-called white folks, from Scotland, and, not understanding the whole details, the specifics, and the context. To ship linen and other goods from Le Havre to Malaga. But he told English port officials at Plymouth that the vessel was not, in fact, a Scottish bottom. When he got there, he said, hey, I'm not really Scottish, man, This is not a Scottish ship, It's like full of us, And in a notorious case during July of 1658, Carvajal, Robles, and a group of their associates broke into a customs warehouse at the port of London and liberated a sizable parcel of logwood that Carvajal had imported from the West Indies via the Canary Islands in a Dutch bottom. Now it was Dutch, you see. He's traveling on so-called Dutch ship, so-called Scottish ship, so-called Irish ship. That one was financed by the English. It's not even, none of them, it's just him. You guys see? You can say some like imposters, but also it's just they're trying to survive. They had all the connects. They were the ancient navigators, merchants, so-called Phoenicians. They're related to all these people from the ancient past, right? So they had all these connects, right? And also they're fleeing the Inquisition, so they have to kind of hide. So a lot of times, yes, it became a thing to continue the life for their benefit, pretend there's somebody else to stay alive, while others are getting burned at the stake, murdered, or forced to convert, things like that. So, or relocated. So still in 1650, misgivings about the potential of Jewish presence in England appeared to spring largely from religious ideology, as had been true a few decades earlier. In the Netherlands, England badly needed trade, and anyone who could assist in the country's economic development was welcomed. As the respective cases of Carvajal and Robles highlight, Jews brought a range of mercantile competencies to the English market that were simply lacking in the domestic population. if their status as non-Christians, or perhaps more accurately, as non-Protestants, was somehow fraught, economic necessity soon became the final arbiter of the religious question. At least initially, a Jewish merchant need only to apply to the crown for indemnization to give the appearance of acting within the terms of the new law. The Jewish merchants who intended to trade with any seriousness of purpose pursued this path to legitimacy. 90 at least were naturalized in this fashion between 1655 and 1680. By 1680, however, the growing prowess of English merchants in overseas trade had led to the rise of intensive competition between Jewish merchants pursuing English trade and their English counterparts at home and abroad. I also want to remind everybody, this is a lot of your ancestors we're talking about. Let's not, a lot of your ancestors, trust me. Attitudes toward Jewish activities and trade thus quickly shifted from generally neutral toward the sharply negative. Now the Navigation Acts became the principal means for challenging the right of Jews to freely engage in a trade that, in the minds of many, should properly lie in English hands. Between 1680 and 1660 and 1680, English merchants submitted a variety of petitions to local, provincial, and national authorities, complaining about Jewish trading techniques and questioning the right of Jewish merchants to trade in England and its colonies on equal terms with English merchants. It was not long before the local authorities initiated legal proceedings seeking to invalidate the claims of Jewish merchants. The earliest of these appears to have been the Admiralty prosecution of the New York merchant Rabba County in Jamaica, in 1671, all right, in which County's credentials as an English subject were questioned precisely because he was a Jew. An instance that struck closer to the heart of Anglo Jewry, as it were, was the complaint lodged by Royal Customs Agent Samuel Hayne from Falmouth. In October 1680, Hayne examined the cargo of the ship Experiment, only to find that goods entered under the name of the captain, an English Quaker, listen, supposedly, were in fact co-signed to 35 different traders, all according to Hayne's account, allegedly Jews. Okay? Body bag for the illusion. This is what I've been trying to tell you. Who's the so-called Quakers? I'm trying to tell you something. Who's the so-called Puritans, Pilgrims, Huguenots, so-called Dutch? I'm trying to tell you something here. And doesn't mean separate from you. These might be your other ancestors, not the only ones, but your other ancestors. Supposed to be English Quakers, huh? But allegedly they were all Jews. Who is the real Mormons? Mormons. Black Quakers. So who's the Quakers? Oh, we're gonna get deep, guys. I'm gonna tell you. We're just getting started, guys. Like, we're about to get really deep. I see it. I see it. Sometimes I put the pieces together in my head and then I go look for it. And based on the research we've done, the logic, I conclude in my head, like, yo, it's most likely this and this and this. And then I go and I find it. And I didn't know this book was going to confirm this part too. Like, listen, this is why I like reading these things, right? This is a scholarly book. Like, he got sources for days. Like, you can verify this. So how many people that were actually supposedly Quakers, Puritans, and all these people that are coming are actually or allegedly Jews or crypto Jews or crypto Muslims? Huh? How many times did this really happen? It was Haynes' accusation that by falsely registering the goods, the merchants and the captain had attempted to cheat the crown out of the 154 pounds in customs duty that would ordinarily have been assessed as aliens duty under the Navigation Acts, had the true state of ownership been declared upon the ship's arrival. All right, one second. Gotta close my room door. My dog just walked in, left it open. Come on, Molly, you gotta close the door when you come in. Don't you know I'm live? So it says Haynes' case hinged on the claim that the Jewish merchants were not entitled to conduct trade either in England or its possessions as English subjects. As a consequence of their status as non-subjects, they could not therefore have registered their ownership of the goods in question without incurring the excess duty. Certainly, the fact that the experiment was en route from Barbados, listen to where they're coming from Barbados, I bet you they had some Indians up in there, with a final destination in Amsterdam, was sufficient in itself to rouse concern. From Barbados to Amsterdam, oh yeah, these are black folks, guys, believe it or not, in these times. But when Hayne learned she had failed to unload her cargo at Falmouth for examination, as the law required, his suspicion were piqued or piqued, piqued? I don't know how to say that. Without knowing the particulars of the traders to whom the goods on board were co-signed, he attempted to condemn the goods under the Navigation Acts, only to be confronted by Antonio Gomez Serra and Antonio Baruch Lusada, two Jewish merchants working together in partnership and based in London, who had been granted patents of indemnization from the Crown in 1672 and 1675, respectively. Once the jury had concluded that the goods belonged to Lusada and Gomez Serra, Hayne found himself without an effective legal recourse to act against the fraud he believed had been perpetrated against the Crown Customs. Instead, he wrote up his experience with the experiment case, dedicated the tract to King James II, and published it along with the suggestion that the Crown assert its authority to charge alien customs against all Jewish merchants, a proposal that in fact would ensure that Jews, whether indemnized or not, would always constitute a separate and unequal class of subjects. A similar case filed in 1684 in Rhode Island by that colony's surveyor general appeared to underscore the general assessment of those charged with the enforcement of the Navigation Acts that Jews were not eligible to take advantage of the English subjects' license to pay duties at the lower rates, no matter how long the term of residence. Although the Rhode Island case concluded with the return of seized goods to the Jewish merchants involved, the Jews were promised only such protection here as any strangers being not of our nation residing amongst us, providing, of course, that they remained obedient to His Majesty's laws. These case points to the most significant challenge faced by these cases point to the most significant challenge faced by Jewish merchants in the Atlantic world, the negotiation of imperial boundaries. Jews initially shared some of the characteristics of these negotiations with other groups of merchants living in diaspora during the 17th century. The Scots, listen, so-called Scots, the Quakers, so-called Quakers, and who? The Huguenots, all right? The Huguenots, sprang readily to mind. These kind of come up. Who are they talking about specifically? Give me a name. Let me research who he was. To a greater or lesser extent. Yet by the early 18th century, most of the circumstances that had segregated Scottish, Quaker, and Huguenot merchants from their English counterparts were in the process of dissolving, all right? Who's the Huguenots, guys? Right? A lot of them ex-Sephardic Jews and Moors who fled Spain and Portugal, ended up in southern France and became known as the Huguenots. Huguenot. England and Scotland were formerly allied as Britain under the 1707 Act of Union, which led to great prosperity for Scottish merchants who now operated in the full benefit of the Navigation Acts and English overseas possessions, a particular boon to Glasgow's infamous tobacco magnates. The deep fears about Quaker theology, which had led to the ostracism of that group during the decades of early Quaker activism, wound sharply after 1689 as the Toleration Act, the Affirmation Act, and other liberal policies legitimized their independent social standing, and the French themselves adopted doctrinal reforms that resulted in a less confrontational public style. And Huguenot merchants long sheltered in England as refugees from Catholic persecution, just like Moors and Sephardic Jews, right? Why the Huguenots getting persecuted the same way? The same people increasingly allied themselves with Protestant Dutch. They allied themselves with who? With Protestants. Like I said earlier, this is all the same people, guys. A lot of these so-called Protestants are ex-Sephardic Jews, ex-Moors. They didn't want to be Catholics, so they became Protestants or Christians, or they just pretended to be. They're crypto Jews, meaning secret Jews. As part of the larger Protestant International, we got so many videos on this, guys. You got to go way back and work your way up. Creating kingship networks that comprise, listen, so-called French, so-called Dutch, and so-called English Protestants. Who's all these people? Give me a name. This is what I'm trying to tell you. I bet I'll prove it. I'll prove it. Start giving me names. Of all these groups, it was thus the Jews alone who continued to face barriers, often rendered insurmountable by differences, whether real or perceived, in religion, language, and culture. Their situation as non-participants kept at the margins of the Anglo-American polity, unlike those of other groups in mercantile diaspora, would not change until well into the 19th century. For some Jewish merchants, boundary negotiations were necessitated by their geographical movements. For others, it resulted from the in situ shifts in imperial jurisdiction over the particular geographic site in which they were established. But in either event, it meant coming to terms with shifting ideologies about the role of commerce in colonial development, as well as adapting to the changing conditions of local and transatlantic markets. One locus that epitomized both kinds of change was colonial New York. Discussion of the Jewish presence in Dutch New Amsterdam, right? Who really were the first so-called Europeans that were colonizing New York? We've already gone over this. A lot of them are these people. So-called Dutch are a lot of crypto Jews and ex-Muslim Moors, Moriscos, Marranos, yeah, under the flag of Dutch now, coming from Amsterdam, right? New Jerusalem, and now they named New Amsterdam, New York. These are the people. We got videos all over this. Like, we got so much proof. And this is like from primary sources. Like we're reading right now. Like this guy is talking about primary sources. Discussion of the Jewish presence in Dutch New Amsterdam and later English New York invariably focuses on the struggle by Jews toward the achievement of the privileges of civil, that is to say, legal equality, often to the exclusion of more compelling themes. A number of studies have highlighted the role of Asir, Asir Levi, Asir, the Duke of Tears, you mean? Asir, huh? Asir Levi. I can't make this up, guys. Moorish Sephardic Jew. Van Swellum as a catalyst of progress toward the inclusion of the Jews in the colonial polity of New Amsterdam. And indeed, Levi played an important role in pushing Director General Stuyvesant and his council into giving ground of the rights question for Jews in New Netherland. It was Levi, for example, who was first among the Jews to petition the court of New Amsterdam for the burgher right, April 1657, arguing that the same privileges had already been granted to Jews in the Netherlands. That's because they're running the Netherlands. They are the politicians, they everything there now. This logic failed to prove persuasive, but a petition to the Director General and the Council of New Netherland by 4 of his Sephardic compatriots, nevertheless succeeded in producing an order to effectuate the desired change in the alleged policy. And it was, now it could be, I'm saying Levi, it could be Levy, right? Levy, maybe as well. So Levy, let's just say Levy, right? Like John Levy. and it was Levi as well who first pursued the right to bear arms and perform militia service in lieu of paying the odious exemption fee imposed by ordinance of the council. Though initially denied this request by the time of his petition for the burgher right, 18 months later he could report that he indeed keeps watch and ward along with New Amsterdam's burghers or burghers, right, like the middle class. Yet there has been no study to date of the principal motivation for Levi's dogged pursuit of the burgher right, that is, his determination to succeed economically in the colonial trade. As Jacob Rader Marcus astutely observed, the accumulation of documents asserting legal privileges, and it should be noted that Levi took the trouble to present a copy of his Horsterbrief from the city of Amsterdam to help him make the case for his burgher right in New Amsterdam, was closely allied with the right to conduct trade under the laws of the nation in which the privileges were being sought. Throughout early modern Europe, Jews were routinely presumed to be aliens unless proven otherwise, and thus devoid of many legal rights relative to property that were inherent to legitimate subjects. So when they mean subjects to citizens, that's how they call them, subjects. Jewish merchants thus sought to assemble documents that established their fitness for whatever legal privileges the law would allow them, primarily as means to protect themselves from untoward hindrance by local authorities as they engage in transnational and transatlantic mercantile activities, right? Subjects, right? Just like a citizen, you're a subject too of the corporation. Once obtained, legal protections could nevertheless be wielded by the recipient as a double-edged sword. They could, of course, be deployed defensively to circumvent restrictions around an incipient livelihood, but they also had great utility for certain claims to an even broader set of privileges. Indeed, Johannes Megapolensis underscored this point in his well-known 1655 letter to the classics of Amsterdam, writing a few months after the arrival of Jewish refugees from Recife. From where? From Brazil, guys. Remember, they had to go back because the Catholics had kicked them out of all that, South American countries they were in. Especially Brazil, Guyana, we're going to read today a little bit. All the other ones, they were everywhere there. So a lot of them had, instead of going to other Caribbean islands or New York, they had gone back to Holland. So these refugees from Recife, or Brazil, Domin Megapolensis cruelly referenced rumors of the imminent construction of a synagogue in New Amsterdam when he complained that these people, example Jews, have no other God than mammon of unrighteousness and no other aim than to get possession of Christian property and to overcome all other merchants by drawing all trade toward themselves. Yeah, that does sound like a Chazar thing. Like, what makes Asir's Levi's situation intriguing is therefore not that he chose to ask for the burgher right, but rather what he did with it once the authorities relented. Of all the Jews appearing in the records of New Netherland, Levi is unique. He was one of only a few, listen, he was only what? A few what? Ashkenazi among the Jews. One, very few, one of very few. I told you when we talk about, listen, guys, pay attention to me. So we talk about literally like before the 1800s in general, when they were talking about Jews and history, like in the Americas or ship owners, or it was mostly Sephardic Jews, right, from Spain and Portugal. In general, these people were people of color, melanated people. So, like it's telling you here, this guy is an exception. He was one of only a few Ashkenazi among the Jews. Jacob Bar Simpson. Bar Simpson. Wow. Yo, hold up. Hold up. That's where they got the name from. You guys see that? That's where they got his name from. Bart Simpson. All right. Bart Simpson. Look at that. It was a so called Jewish last name. I mean, we know Simpson was already, but wow. Bart Simpson, huh? They got to say in their name, bro. They got to say in their name. That's funny. So Jacob Bart Simpson can be identified as another, as well as the only Jewish arrival from 1654 to remain in New Amsterdam as a permanent resident until the time of his death. He was only the only Jew to have lived in New Amsterdam both before and after its transfer to English rule. He was not the first Jew to attempt to construct a mercantile trade in the colony, nor was he the wealthiest among his compatriots, but he persisted when the better capitalized and well-connected Sephardi merchants surrendered and moved away. You see what happened? The Ashkenazi, they kind of took over the trade and everything they had unlocked, the Sephardic people, when they moved away or were persecuted some more or were disenfranchised and eventually turned into reclassify, paper genocide. You know how it goes. After 1660, he experienced periods when he was the only Jewish man, for one of only two Jewish men in the colony, suggesting that he had an isolated religious life. When Levi arrived in New Amsterdam, he was a man of middle years, probably in his 30s. It is not known when his wife Miriam joined him, but she was living in New York by 1674, and she remained there until her death in 1688. She may have come with him in 1654, or perhaps when he returned to New Netherlands from a business trip to Amsterdam and Germany made in the spring of 1660. For at least part of his time in New Amsterdam, it is probable that a seer, Levi, lived a lonely existence. Poor seer. Yet Levi persevered in constructing a life in New Netherlands that was equally devoted to mercantilism and to Judaism, and over the years his trade began to prosper. Rather than attempt to evade the laws and regulations of the colony as Carvajal Robles and other Sephardic merchants were doing, what did he do different, huh? He seems to have been steadfast in playing by the rules. Who? The Ashkenazi dude. He's the other guys who? The Sephardics ain't playing by the rules. They ain't trying to listen. This is deep, man. This is like I know you might not see how deep this is like I do, but if you have been following along very thoroughly about the difference, right, of these people, right, you see what is literally telling you right here. The Ashkenazi dude, he played by the rules. He got to continue the trade. He got to get wealthier. In October of 1660, he began to leave poverty behind him when he was licensed as one of 6 sworn butchers for the city of New Amsterdam. So he was in poverty, huh? Sephardic Jews were not. They weren't in poverty. When the Catholics started taking over the Inquisition, these people were living a good life for a long time, talking about hundreds of years with the rulers, which were Muslims, Moors, Moorish people they were living with under them. Very successful. So this guy was in poverty before this. Huh. Careful in the process to petition that, unlike the others, he be considered exempt from butchering hogs and that he be sworn on the Old Testament alone. Both, it was noted, as requisite to his religious identity as a Jew. By December 1662, he was paying taxes as a burgher of New Amsterdam, albeit the only Jew among them, and by January 1665, though certainly not the wealthiest of New Amsterdam's burghers, he had accumulated sufficient wherewithal to have hired Aki Johnson's daughter as a housemaid. Hired, indenture, The inventory taken of his estate in 1682 indicates a well-appointed household, containing plenty of iron pots, brass, pewter for everyday use, or pewter, 2 pillow beds with all the requisite linens, and all elegant suit of clothes consisting of gross grain, breeches, silk stockings, a black velvet jacket, a 6-pound cotton wig, a black beaver hat. Included in his stock for trade were table linens, various items of clothing, shirts, smocks, petticoats, bodices, underclothes, aprons, stockings, neck clothes, linen, hoods, lace caps, a variety of silver vessels and decorative items, and gold and silver jewelry, as well as 50 skipples of salt, 2 barrels of tar, and some timber and plank to build a house. His business dealings were extensive. At the time of his death in 1682, some 440 persons owed money to Sir Levi, their names painstakingly listed longhand on 13 folio pages at the end of the inventory. This snapshot of Asir Levi's stunning success tells only a part of his story. What gave him the confidence to cross the Atlantic and establish himself in trade on the wild frontiers of the Americas? Where did he find the nerve to take on the established Dutch and English powers of the colony in pursuit of legal privileges for Jews like himself? These are perhaps the obvious questions. Less obvious but more interesting is how he managed to achieve what he did in a comparatively barren and unfriendly environment. An analysis of his debt and credit network, combined with the evidence from extant court records, shed some light on Levi's business tactics. First, of the more than 400 debtors listed on Levi's estate inventory, about 240 can be associated with a particular geographic area within the colony. Some of these identifications were made by Levi himself. Others can be determined from extant court records from New York City and Albany, while the majority of these persons, as we might expect, were located near Levi's home base in New York City or its vicinity, including the 5 Dutch towns and the English towns on Long Island and in Westchester. Approximately 60 can be identified as residents of the Hudson Valley region, 36 of them in Albany, alone, and another 20 in Esopus. In addition, about 2 dozen of his contacts in New York City also had ongoing connections to Hudson Valley for property or trade and occasionally made trips there. Levi's interest in the Hudson Valley and the trading opportunities it offered came early on his sojourn in New Netherland. Between August 1658 and July 1659, he sued 6 different persons in the courts at Fort Orange for debts of various kinds. By July of 1660, he was doing business with John Michelson, who purchased goods from him to the value of 184 guilders in good mercantile beavers, in return for which Levi accepted a mortgage on Michelson's house in Beverwyck, pending the projected payment in the debt in June 1661. The following year, he purchased the Beverwyck house of Marcellus Jansen von Bommel at public vendue for the sum of 1,709 guilders, payable in 3 annual installments. He immediately leased the property, then sold it the following year for 1,920 guilders and beaver, a handsome profit by any stretch of the imagination. But his investment in real estate in Fort Orange suggests a certain permanence in his interest in the upper Hudson Valley. Indeed, an ongoing character of Levi's business in Albany was recognized by the Albany court in August 1670, when the justices ordered him to pay 30 florins toward the needs of this place, although Levi continued to reside in New York City. The precise nature of Levi's trade is elusive. However, the evidence does suggest some patterns. Although only a few of Levi's accounts identify the debtor with a profession, the entries that list such an association give the impression that a healthy portion of his activities meant dealing with tradesmen. The several butchers and shoemakers are listed can be expected from the fact that Levi was a licensed butcher who, at the time of his death, was operating a slaughterhouse in company with Garrett James Roos or Jans Roos. However, the preponderance of bakers, millers, brewers, tailors, and weavers among the trades listed suggests that Levi was also trading in grain, flour, and fabrics, a notion that is confirmed by some marginal notes concerning particular commodities either delivered or owed. Example, blue boar, Indian corn, wheat, and flour. The few carpenters and glaziers of the list suggest a connection to the building trades, as do the references to plank and wood. Several hatters on the list make a logical link to the furs that Levi frequently accepted as payment for goods, particularly from his contacts in the Hudson Valley, where fur remained an accepted form of currency. However, the list also reflects appreciable contact with public officials and with many other merchants in New York City, as well as with farmers in the towns of Long Island and Westchester. If, as the inventory of his estate suggests, Levi was supplying European goods to many of his trade contacts, how was he getting these? The evidence suggests that he employed various means to maintain his transatlantic supply connections. In 1660, he made a voyage to Amsterdam to settle some mercantile affairs, likely renewing some contacts at the time. The following April, Sophia van Wickerslot of Beverwyck and her husband Anthony Toynel recorded her conveyance to Levi of her interest in all the goods and merchandise which she is expecting out of Patria, example Holland, by the ship Beaver, co-signed to her by her father, in return for a 75% advantage on the cost of the goods, plus freight to be paid by Levi. Further, Levi cemented his trading connections by serving as an attorney for correspondence on the opposite side of the Atlantic. In May of 1662, he acted on behalf of Abraham Cohen in Amsterdam to bring suit against merchant Cornelis Pluvier for the redemption of a mortgage made between Cohen and Pluvier and secured by a house in New Amsterdam. So we've been learning about this guy right here, right? Asir Levi, right? It's Ashkenazi. For some reason, that's what they're focusing on, right? Ghost figures, right? Not on many Sephardic Jews had the same kind of thing going on. More actually. When they're saying he's going back to Amsterdam and he's making trade, he's mostly trading with the Sephardic. That's his connects. He's got the connects because they treat him like a fellow so-called Jew, right? He's got all the connects and he's taking advantage of that. He's playing by the rules, you see? Asir Levi evidently had a vision for how to make the Hudson Valley trade profitable. That vision was not widely shared by other Jewish merchants interested in partaking of the opportunities offered by the river and its traffic. One of Levi's contemporaries in New Amsterdam, Jacob de Lucena, here we go, de Lucena, was also engaged in trading on the Hudson over a period of years, like I said, but he never built the kinds of contacts or property interests in Albany that Levi was able to establish. Lucena had occasion to sue merchant Thomas Davis in 1671 after Davis failed to deliver in good order a parcel of stockings to be transported for Albany in the defendant's ship. 3 years later, Lucena was embroiled in a dispute over 25 skepels of wheat he said were owed to him by Mr. Paulin at Esopus, and that he had asked the defendant to receive it on his behalf, a sample of the sundry debts due to him in those places. But Lucena never cultivated the respect of English authorities, and in 1678 he was forced to petition Governors Andros for a pass to trade in Albany and Esopus, complaining that he had been unfairly prevented from pursuing his interests there by the New York City Customs House. Wow, why they treating the brother different, huh? I'm being real. Why they treating the brother different? De Lucena, huh? I bet you he's Portuguese or Spanish. Sephardic Jew, I bet you. Although he had already entered and cleared a shipment aboard the sloop Beverwyck and paid the duty assessed, just as he had during the course of the preceding 8 years, without any let or hindrance, as other traders and dealers have done. Look, he's even following the rules, guys. Listen. He found that his right to trade in Hudson Valley was now suddenly in question, and that his shipment would not be allowed to proceed without the governor's leave. All right. So Asir Levi, the Ashkenazi guy, he's getting allowed to do all this stuff. Now we got De Lucena, the Sephardic Jew. He's not. Nope. The Hudson Valley trade also attracted a number of other Jewish merchants whose only view was to make a living for themselves in the most expedient manner, you see? So now it's attracting different type of so-called Jew, ones that are like more greedy, hey, all about themselves, making my money, not about helping everybody else. Because that's what a lot of Sephardics were doing, helping everybody else come flee the Inquisition. Two of these were Joseph Brown and Isaac Gabay, who apparently arrived in New York in 1686 without knowledge of English law. The two quickly ran afoul of a statute prohibiting the boarding of a vessel before the master had reported her arrival to the custom house, and they were fined accordingly. The pair petitioned for remission of this fine and subsequently were indemnized, with liberty to trade or traffic. Shortly thereafter, they were licensed to peddle in the county of Ulster. These counterexamples helped set the coordinated enterprise of Asir Levi into relief, where merchants such as Lucena, Brown, and Gabe perceived the prospect of selling as their golden opportunity. Levi thought buying was an equally important aspect of his transactions, trading at a time when the colony was still in its infancy and the primary economic emphasis lay with sending exportable raw materials back to Europe. Asir Levi learned to capitalize on serving the needs of Dutch and English settlers by supplying those on the frontier with the trappings of Europe and taking payment in commodities that could be sold downriver in New York City, either for local use or for export. What Asir Levi knew was that only by filling the hold of his ships both for the voyage and the return trip could a merchant hope to make his transactions profitable and, in the words of John McCusker, manage his risk. Prosperity for an urban Jew operating from the margins of society hinged on how successful he was in cultivating the surrounding rural hinterland, both as a market for the products that he could deliver and as a supplier of the commodities that he could sell. Whatever those particular items might be, the process remained a two-way street. And again, that might include Indian slaves or just slaves, any type of slave in general, too. If Carvajal and Levi represented the archetypal 17th century market chameleon, able to adapt to variable markets under varied kinds of authority, one in the fraught environment of internecine Anglo-European conflict, and the other in a frontier society whose ownership was embroiled in the contest between the Dutch and the English for transatlantic prowess. The successful Jewish merchants of 18th century British American port towns were equally the products of their time and place. To understand the context in which they operated, we must come to the terms with the world as they knew it. Their world was one in which the market dominance of raw materials was well matched by the growing significance of manufactures, in which the gentility of a man or woman was marked by the discreet employment of polite refinements rather than the accumulation of commodities. This was as true in the American colonies as it was in the metropolitan London, even if it differed by degree. The marketplace of the 18th century British Atlantic was complex and multifaceted, incorporating producers, consumers, and technologies into a dynamic from which use and meaning could be constructed or derived. This was a world in which, as David Hancock has put it, consumers expected to be heard and heeded. To succeed in this world, Jewish merchants, therefore, had to master not only the rules of supply and demand, but also the increasingly more important question of consumer confidence. In 1986, Timothy Breen first drew attention to the Anglicization of North American markets during the 18th century. So, Anglicization in parentheses, right? Since that time, scholarship on colonial consumption patterns has evolved slowly and sparingly. A few scholarly works have examined the transatlantic nature of the flow of British goods, but more work in colonial economic history has focused on the culture of selling consumer goods rather than on that of buying them. More recently, scholarly discussion has shifted away from the volume of British goods imported into North American colonies and towards the social uses to which they were put, that is, to advance the polite refinement and gentility of those colonies gaining an affluence. Still, little attention has been paid to the developing networks of colonial consumption and distribution in which both sellers and buyers played integral roles. These networks not only helped to make the colonies a superior marketplace for British manufacturers, but also linked the economies of the individual colonies together and helped them to achieve competency. Apart from the metropolitan markets in London and Bristol, the understudied secondary trade between the colonies, sometimes called the coastal trade, was also transatlantic in the broadest sense. While it made no direct contribution to the coffers of the crown or those of London's growing merchant class, it helped stabilize colonial markets by meeting the consumption needs of British Americans, and in that way contributed to the articulation of a comprehensive system of imperial commerce. While there is much scholarship to document the manner in which the colonies provided Britain with ready supplies of raw materials necessary for British textile manufactures and consumer commodities, only a few scholars have attempted to delineate the marketing of consumer goods produced in the colonies themselves, and recent discussions on refinement and its spread there is another missing component, namely the merchants who served as midwives to this process by mediating the exchange of colonial products. All right. The merchants, the middle people, who's the merchants? Like who's making all this happen, guys? This is what I'm saying. So they were the ones mediating the exchange of colonial products for imported goods. Here I will address how some Jewish merchants in British America worked to develop consumer markets for a number of markers of respectable genteel culture in the colonial context, including Scotch snuff, Spermaceti candles, tea, and fine wines, specifically Portuguese wines and cordials. These items played a key role in the growing colonial cult of gentility and refinement during the middle decades of the 18th century. Jewish merchants epitomized the transformation to a market economy in the British American colonies, involving both the development of commodities desirable to the ordinary household and the evolution of a middle class with a disposable income. Consumers on the American side of the British Atlantic competed with one another for access to the best quality goods to prove their gentility and their fitness for entree into a polite society constructed on the English model. Jewish merchants alternately fed and were fed by the consumer impulse, importing and selling genteel commodities such as English textiles, china, metalware, Portuguese wines, tea, sugar, West Indies rum, chocolate, and coffee. They were also instrumental in local manufactures by which genteel consumers' goods were created from raw materials. So, guys, one thing they leave out in this book is the commodity that they not specifying. We're talking about human commodity. We're talking about slaves in these same ships going back and forth, Americas and Europe, Americas and Europe. Yeah, both ways, right? In short, Jewish merchants kept themselves busy developing markets for consumer products, both those of local manufacture and those imported from abroad. Jewish artisans with aspirations to affluence were also quick to tap into these developments, as Leo Herskowitz has described it. The relationship between the English physician Peter Middleton and the Jewish goldsmith Myers of New York City grew largely out of Myers' desire to develop contacts among a class of potential consumers. In the extant medical logbook kept by Dr. Middleton of his services to his patients, Hershkowitz found evidence that the ongoing relationship between Middleton and Myers as doctor and patient was informed as much by Myers' desire for entry to the circle of New York society, which desired and could afford the silver plate he created, as it was by his desire for good medical services. Although it is unclear when their interest in snuff as a bendable commodity began, extant records show that by the 1730s, New York's Jewish merchants were investing in its manufacture. During that decade, two Jewish partners from New York, Michael Lashner and Isaac Solomon, had set up a snuff mill in Boston. With financial backing from their wealthy New York merchant counterpart Mordecai Gomez, their partner wealthier as their connect, as these people's connect. I'm starting to see what's going on here, right? Who also served as their primarily, like I just said, who also served as their primary supplier of raw tobacco. That's their connect, the so-called black man, Mordecai Gomez, Sephardic Jew. However, the Boston partners to this venture soon fell to squabbling, and shortly thereafter the partnership devolved into litigation before the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. The production of snuff was also among the earliest joint manufacture and marketing ventures in which Jewish merchants were engaged in 18th century Newport. Established in 1750 by a trio of New York Jews, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, okay, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, Moises Lopez, and Aaron Nunez Cardoso. All right, you guys see the names who developed that? So-called Jewish merchants in New York. That's why I told you. I know he was talking about an Ashkenazi guy, but that's like he said, one of the few. In general, it was Sephardic Jews, guys, before the 1800s. Again, 1750, right? Established by a trio. And what did Benjamin Franklin say in the 1750s? Yeah. So again, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, ya tú sabes. Moisés López, ya tú sabes. Aarón Núñez Cardoso, ok. ¿Me entiende? Pura vida, mi gente. Yeah. The Scotch snuff manufactory was operated by them at least through 1752. During this time, Cardoso resided in Newport and oversaw the operations of the snuff mill, while Rivera and Lopez were responsible for marketing the product in New York, evidently filling a void in the consumer market left by the earlier demise of the Boston venture. The nature of this trade should not be overstated. The manufacture of snuff was indeed a far cry from the large-scale purchase and transport of whole tobacco crops, which was the business of Virginia's notorious Scottish factors. Unlike tobacco factorage, however, snuff manufacture required comparatively little from the merchant in terms of capital investment or transatlantic connections. Snuff also appears to have been easy commodity to make, and its manufacture was apparently widespread among Jewish merchants in the British colonies, even those merchants whose primary trading activities centered on the export of colonial produce and the import of finished British manufactures were, like Naphtali and Isaac Hart of Newport, likely to maintain a snuff mill on their town lots or country estates. Almost any grade of tobacco might be used, from the finest Virginia or Havana leaf to stalks of Santo Domingo or something called Negro head. Listen, who's growing the tobacco since ancient times? The Indians, right? Why is it called Negro head? Who's growing it in these times too? So Virginia or Havana. So we're talking about tobacco, huh? Who got to connect to the tobacco? The trick lay in the manner of curing the tobacco by soaking or drying and in the creation of flavored varieties that would be appealing to the discerning consumer. A surviving letter of the Jamaican merchant Isaac Mendes de Sola, Isaac Mendes de Sola, Portuguese, Jamaican merchant, huh? Portuguese, Sephardic Jew, just like Sean Paul's ancestors, right? You guys saw his genealogy? Oh, yeah, we're going to talk about that one soon. From the early 19th century, transmits a series of such receipts for particularly genteel types of snuff, including rose, flavored with brandy, and other of roses. You guys hear these? Flavored roll up, flavored tobacco, huh? Like how they have today, huh? Who was doing that? Well, they were doing that from way back. So we got flavored, here tobacco full of flavors, right? They're doing this naturally, though. That's the difference back then. So flavored with brandy and attar of roses, black macuba, which is sun-dried and flavored using an old brandy with essence of garlic to treat the bottle. Wow. Uh-oh. Irish blackguard, oven-dried and treated with spirits of wine. Wow. And Danish, soaked in a heady combination of molasses, sweet oil, and laudanum, and then flavored with vanilla, garden balsam, and tonquin. Wow. Hey, it sounds interesting. Try that one. In addition, snuff could be produced in relatively small quarters, a key factor for merchants living in town. Hey guys, what did Benjamin Franklin tell Paco Carlos? Paco, you gotta catch up, man. Tell Paco Carlos what Benjamin Franklin said in the 1750s, guys. We got the primary source from himself. In short, snuff represented an ideal commodity for the Jewish merchant looking to expand into the market of genteel refinement. It was relatively undemanding, required comparatively little in capital investment, and techniques and equipment were easily transportable if need be. And it resulted in a product that appealed to a class of consumers with ready money to spend on luxury goods who might also, if one played one's cards correctly, provide the up-and-coming merchant with the necessary social entree for overall success, all right? What was making them successful, guys? Pay attention. The tobacco, the Indians' crop. Small wonder then that the Jewish merchants who moved frequently from port to port found it an appealing commodity. Nevertheless, the retail marketing of snuff was somewhat complicated. It required, above all, the construction and cultivation of good repute. No mean feat for Jewish merchants, particularly in markets ruled by public prejudices about the dishonesty and cupidity of Jews, especially those involved in trade. This was a lesson that snuff merchant Emmanuel Abrams would learn during the autumn of 1754, when his business conduct was grossly impugned by one of his would-be suppliers, Allen Melville, in the pages of the Boston Gazette. It was Melville's claim that Abrahams, a Jew, had not only had the notorious impudence to go through the town selling a certain kind of trash of his own making, but that in order to make it so quick, he had done so by using a known brand named Kippens, and said he obtained the snuff from Melville. Of course, an imputation of this type could not be permitted to let stand, but rather than respond to Melville with threats, Abrahams chose to address his credit and reputation with the public at large. Melville's claim was without foundation, he said, but since Mr. Melville is pleased to give my goods the character of trash and musty trash, he countered by offering samples on trial so that customers could judge for themselves. He's like, all right, you think my thing is bad? I mean, what are they really talking about here, guys? Like, yeah, I know they're talking about tobacco, but what do they mean? What are they adding something else to it? I try mine so that customers could judge for themselves. Evidently, it was not enough for Jewish merchant to state, I always treated my customers with the utmost civility and the best of goods. In a diffident market like Boston, where suspicion of Jews abounded, where in Boston, park your car right there, yeah. What? Where suspicion of Jews abounded, proof was required. I've been trying to tell you, so-called English, so-called Puritans, so-called Pilgrims. I've been trying to tell you. Boston, huh? I grew up in Boston, guys. Yeah, I'm from the Bean. 617. Yeah. Although the Newport snuff mill ventured by Rivera, Lopez, and Cardoso was apparently short-lived, it represented only the first of many such efforts of Rivera and Lopez to manufacture consumer goods. They could use their mercantile skills to vend the growing consumer market throughout the British colonies. Their next venture proved even more significant: the manufacture of candles from tallow, green wax, and most importantly, the spermaceti obtained through local whaling operations. New England, the whaling operations, guys. Shout out to the Cape Verdeans and the Indians. Most of the time, it's the same people. Yeah, New England, the first whalers were Indians who taught the Sephardic, Portuguese merchants, all these people how to whale and make it a business. The Indians of New England taught them that. They were going out into sea whaling, guys. The Indians were doing that. The Candleman factory, unlike the snuff mill, was a large-scale venture, requiring significant capital investment, more than either Jacob Rivera or Moses Lopez possessed. For this purpose, therefore, Rivera and Lopez turned to outside investors. One significant investor in the candles work in its earliest phase was the Boston merchant John Bannister, who later moved to Newport. In fact, Bannister's extant account book reveals that by July 1750, Moses Lopez was drawing on Bannister for the capital necessary, and notes that by July 18, 1752, Bannister's gain from his investment in this enterprise amounted to 900. What's this? Whoa, hold up. Let me see. 972,710. Is that what it's saying? I don't even know what it's saying here, guys. It has 2 points. Or maybe just 972,100 pounds, 7/10, maybe. The success of Rivera and Lopez in producing vendable candles attracted others in Rhode Island to the manufacture of Spermaceti candles, including the Brown family of Providence. The Brown family, huh? Within 10 years, a cartel had been formed. A cartel had been formed to control the price at which Spermaceti would be purchased by the Rhode Island manufacturers from local whalers. By 1770, Spermaceti candle manufacturers had sprung up throughout coastal New England and as far south as Philadelphia. Spermaceti candles were marketed not only in the mainland colonies but also in the Caribbean and even across the Atlantic. Clearly, Rivera and Lopez had found a good idea for a highly marketable consumer product. The process of making good candles required skill. It also required sensitivity to the desires of potential consumers. By 1755, Aaron Lopez, who had become involved in the Spermaceti candle venture, wrote to Haman Levi of New York regarding a shipment sent to Levi for sale. Although the candles in question had been prepared in conformity with a sample provided by Levi, Lopez found the sample primitive and could not bear to mention that we are surprised New Yorkers should give the preference to that version of the product. Moses Lopez and Jacob Rodriguez Rivera had begun by producing candles similar to the sample Levi had provided, he wrote, but finding they had not credit in any part of the West Indies because they have their tallow candles from Europe which look as well for shape and whiteness, we improved them by making them more transparent and somewhat to imitate wax, for which reasons they are in so great reputation in the West Indies. In short, when driven to provide a product that could compete with candles of European manufacture, Rivera had experimented with the refining process until he came up with a whiter, more translucent candle. With this adjustment, the Lopez and Rivera candles regained the attention of genteel consumers in the West Indies and impressed some gentlemen there, one of whom wrote to the New York factor Gabriel Ludlow that they preferred my cousin's Rivera's candles to all others. All right, Gabriel Ludlow is a cousin of Rivera, right? Gabriel y Rivera, ya tú sabes. That's his cousin, even though he has Ludlow. I told you guys, so called. That's what I mean, so called. Indeed, Aaron Lopez, could also report other disinterested testimonials to the quality of the candles produced using Rivera's method. A London contact would even warrant that the Lopez and Rivera candles surpass anything of that kind made in England. He nevertheless informed Levi that unless the New York customers were to change their order, the manufactory would continue to turn out candles to match the sample Levi had provided because, as he said, one method of manufacture was just as easy as another and the profits were essentially the same. Here, the Lopez brothers and Rivera openly acknowledged the critical role played by the consumer in defining what constituted refined taste. New York consumers may have wanted a candle that Aaron Lopez considered to be less refined, but he viewed himself as powerless to impose his opinion upon them. It was their judgment, not his, that constituted the ultimate arbiter of taste. Accordingly, he was willing to continue making inferior grade candles to their specifications as long as they so desired, and thus responding to the very different standards of consumers in New York and the West Indies, Lopez and Rivera demonstrated their fitness for the custom of genteel purchasers with their own distinct opinions about what qualities represented refinement in a given product. It might be said that Aaron Lopez himself provides an exemplar of the outsider who became the ultimate insider in Newport. When he arrived in Newport in 1752, with his wife Abigail and their infant daughter, he had little, if any, capital. Nevertheless, he quickly went about the process of setting himself up as a small trader. In this, he was clearly aided by his elder half-brother, Moses, so Moses Lopez, who had by then had been living in Newport for over a decade. However, Aaron Lopez possessed some important qualities of his own which paved the way for his success in Atlantic trade. First, he was already proficient at English, as it is amply demonstrated in his early correspondence. Secondly, he had been raised in a genteel environment and had, by all accounts, mastered the social manners necessary for success in a polite society. That's the hijack. Third, and most important, he perceptively discerned the contours of the Atlantic mercantile world, capitalizing on his brother's deep connections to the Jewish community of New York. Aaron's earliest New York trading contacts included the well-to-do who Daniel Gomez, ya tú sabes, Daniel Gomez, ya tú sabes, pura vida, and the less wealthy, but nonetheless successful Haman, Levi, a merchant of good repute and important connections. Lopez started small, vending at retail a few items obtained on short credit from his New York contacts and reinvesting his small profits in additional consumer goods. The growing middle class in Newport, by the time of his arrival there, hungered for the wide variety of consumer goods available in England itself, and Lopez was eager to take advantage of the opportunities presented by the British American trade. The strategy Lopez used to construct a mercantile enterprise from this small beginning is revealed in his correspondence with Haman Levi. In 1753, within a year of his arrival in Newport, Lopez was already prevailing upon his contacts to vend for him a few boxes of Spermaceti candles in New York and invest the proceeds in tallow. 8 months later, Lopez requested that Levi send him bohea tea, as the weather was too hot in June to contemplate the manufacture of candles. On hearing from Levi that candles were slow to sell and would not be likely to provide the money necessary to pay for the tea, Lopez wrote to Levi with additional instructions and a brief apology. I don't know, but I may press a little hard on your favors. But you must consider I am a beginner. My stock but small, and unless I contrive to keep my little trade in a continual circulation, it can answer the end of my labors. This obliges me to be free with your offers of friendship, and therefore you must have a little patience with my importunities. It was indeed the continual circulation of commodities which made the difference between success and failure for the smaller trader. The particular genius of Aaron Lopez at this stage lay not so much in his salesmanship as in his consciousness of the need to keep his inventory flowing out the door of his shop and into the hands of his customers, and in his careful assessment of consumer demand for particular commodities. In September 1754, for example, he proposed to Levi that the latter extend him credit for a few months, so that Lopez might purchase a large chest of good tea, since what he had previously received from Levi is all sold and could have disposed of a great deal more in my little circulating traffic. In this matter, he was able to assess the demand for good tea at Newport as sufficiently great to outweigh the risk of borrowing the capital needed to make the purchase. The following April, he wrote to Levi expressing his anxieties about the availability of tea and his hope that my expectation for tea will not be disappointed, since he now perceived that recent news of the political situation and impending war with France might have affected availability of tea. He informed Levi that he had reconsidered his rate and would now pay as high as the market price in order to obtain it, since I have been out of that article some time, and in fear shall lose some good customers. Shall I lose? His tragedy thus revealed shows the continual balancing and reconsideration of the relationship between supply and demand for particular commodities, or more significantly, between the merchant and his customers. In the vending of tea and the manufacture of Spermaceti candles, established men like the Jacob or Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, ya tú sabes, and the Lopez brothers, oh, ya tú sabes, pura vida, as merchants who catered to the genteel consumer, was selling of fine wines and cordials cemented the reputation. By 1745, British merchants had established their domination of the trade in Madeira and other Portuguese wines, and these were increasingly added to the list of commodities accorded gentile. Here, of course, Jewish merchants like Aaron Lopez had the distinct advantage in making purchases for discriminating customers because, as one patron noted, you was born in the country from whence it comes, and therefore would be better to able to assess, obtain, and obtain wines of the best quality. Based on an intimate knowledge of the product, Jewish merchants also used their skills to render cordials out of existing stocks of rum or brandy. Here, as with snuff, their success lay in creating varieties that colonial customers were interested in purchasing for use when entertaining their genteel friends and colleagues. Abraham Lopez, who arrived in Newport in 1767, was one Jewish merchant who developed cordial making into a near art form, producing an array of flavors, including anise, aniseed, carons, peach nut, cravo or clove, and limas, lemon, which his brother Aaron happily marketed throughout the colonies from Newfoundland to the Caribbean, all right? The Lopez brothers, guys, Sephardic Jews, most likely people of color. But production of quality item did not always match with consumer taste. Upon receipt of a shipment of 4 kegs from Abraham Lopez, Joshua Hart and Charlestown noted that the Lopez cordials were very fine and good. However, the South Carolina market was so saturated with inferior cordials produced in Boston that he could not expect vigorous sales of those Lopez had sent. Hart suggested to Lopez that only the aniseed and orange liquors were likely to sell in Charlestown because the other sorts are not esteemed here by genteel consumers. So you gotta like what they learning, what they talking about here, guys. I know hopefully it's not too boring for everybody, but to me it's very interesting. Like it's like teaching these people about consumer confidence, supply and demand, all that stuff, right? So in some states, you might think, you're gonna make the same money with this product that you're making in Europe, but it's not the case. He had to do something different everywhere he went. People are different. It's all culture. Literally, people get used to it, right? One person copies the other. Oh no, I like this one. Yeah, we like this one. If cordials were tricky to market, Jewish merchants had an easier time with Portuguese wines. Their success can be measured in part by the central role that wine came to play in their own social activities, right? So again, sorry to interrupt. You know, this is history. This is a lot of the history that a lot of so-called Black history that's never been told, because we always assumed these were all pale skin or white Europeans. So it's just hopefully something that interests you. Might even be some of your ancestors who were established like this and doing this stuff. So, wine along with snuff was used as a gift to impress genteel persons with the merchants' polite manners. When 9 Jewish merchants established their own club in Newport in 1761, they established a genteel social agenda that included the liberty to divert at cards, so long as no member shall presume to play for more than 20 shillings for the first 3 hours of the evening. This was followed by supper, a round of loyal toasts, and any club business a member might choose to raise. The group elected a new chairman every month, who served the largely ceremonial role of making after-dinner toasts and imposing the specified fine of 4 bottles of good wine on members who transgressed club rules against gambling in amounts greater than 20 shillings, behaving unruly, cursing, swearing, or offering to fight. Conversion on synagogue affairs was also prohibited, subject to the same fine. In this, Newport's Jewish merchants also demonstrated that they were as absorbed in the consuming side of the culture of gentility as they were on the vending side of the equation. Examination of the process of marketing. The 4 commodities described here tells us a number of things about the vending of refinement by Jewish merchants. First, it highlights the fact that consumer demand had a determinative impact on the kinds of genteel consumer goods produced in the colonies. As Neil McKendrick has suggested for England, 18th century consumers experienced a marketplace in which there were more goods available than ever before. For the first time, consumers had a cornucopia of choices. In order to distinguish between the various items available for sale, more energy and attention now had to be expended on the process of buying. This change was effective in the British colonies as it was in Britain itself. That brings us to a second point, namely, that in a market where consumers had a multiplicity of choices, Jewish merchants had to take special care to retain the confidence of their customers. Although outsiders might define progress by the turnover in a merchant's shop or warehouse, those Jewish merchants who achieved the greatest returns of their investments knew that their bread and butter lay with satisfied customers. Success depended on being responsive to the needs and desires of customers for good tea, transparent candles, the best quality Lisbon wine, and particular flavors of snuff or cordials. Accordingly, the process of selling to consumers was in many respects highly negotiated, with consumers providing explicit instructions as to the goods they wished to obtain. The Jewish merchants who thrived in this environment were those who quickly developed an artful approach to these intense conversations with their customers. Third, the trading networks that were established by the most successful Jewish merchants, men like Aaron Lopez, Sephardic Jew, were highly complex and encompassed the supply side of the economic equation, as well as feeding consumer demand. In March 1755, for example, Lopez informed Haman Levi that the business I follow has insensible brought me into an acquaintance with the country people with whom drive a small trade in a few articles, and with whom he believed he could barter a significantly larger proportion of dry goods, including English textiles, in return for country produce and local manufactures. Lopez perceived that if this new endeavor meets with such success as the prospect presents now, he could then prosecute and enlarge it, provided, of course, that he could find the right terms for the necessary credit to make it happen. The goal of this small trial, as Lopez described it, was to expand his overall enterprise, improving the main branch of trade I have in hand. By 1758, he had established a trading network in Rhode Island, hinterland that encompassed correspondents in Coventry, Kingston, Warwick, and Cranston, who supplied him with axes, iron pigs, and turkeys in return for textiles, tea, and any sort of consumer goods that would otherwise have required them to make a trip to Newport or Boston. By the mid 1760s, this country trade extended into eastern Connecticut and Long Island, and also encompassed a wider range of goods and manufactures. In this way, a merchant like Aaron Lopez drew the farmers and artisans of the New England countryside into his network and made them participants in an enlarged system for the distribution of consumer goods. Of course, there was nothing about this process in itself that was unique to the Jewish merchant. We could expect to find similar calculations of costs and benefits by successful colonial merchants of nearly any stripe or background, but Jewish merchants were in the unique position of remaining outsiders to the spheres of power and influence, and they lacked recourse to shape policies and laws that would promote and enhance their efforts. Again, the experience of Aaron Lopez, and a case in point when Lopez and Isaac Eliezer, another Jewish merchant, applied for naturalization in Rhode Island in 1762 under the terms of the 1740 Naturalization Act. The two men were denied the right to shed their alien status and become lawful subjects of the crown, once by the colony's General Assembly and twice by its courts. Nonetheless, naturalization, which Lopez managed to obtain in Massachusetts in 1762, still did not culminate in full citizenship right in Rhode Island. Lopez was appointed in 1773 by the Rhode Island General Assembly to a committee consisting of three prominent merchants assigned to investigate colonial fishing rights in the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. Yet this seems a mere sop for the man who, in 1775, was the single most important taxpayer in the town of Newport. All right, we're talking about Sephardic Jew, and a giant among the town's fisheries trade to boost a Sephardic Jew, melanated person, so-called black man. Despite his status as the town's economic powerhouse, there were certain privileges of citizenship that even Lopez could only achieve by means of circumventing local authorities. In Lopez, Rhode Island, unlike Asir Levi's New York, success could not be guaranteed through self-assertion. While naturalization was routinely granted to Jews in other colonies, Jews often face other discriminatory bars. For example, the extraordinary taxation imposed on the Jewish communities of Jamaica and Barbados, between 1690 and 1740. Again, Sephardic Jews, Moorish people, crypto Jews, people of color. The limitation on providing court testimony and on slave ownership in Barbados, 1669 and 1706, and explicit prohibitions on Jewish voting in New York from 1737 and 1760, and Jamaica, 1750 to 1826. Thus, the pressure of Jewish merchants inhabiting the British Atlantic world of the 18th century to be assiduous about the cultivation of customers was necessarily greater than it was on those Anglo-Americans with access to other options. Long restricted from other forms of livelihood, Jews in 18th century British America found themselves largely disinclined to pursue agriculture or engage themselves in artisanal pursuits. Apart from smithing of fine metals, as the career of Myers attests, unlike ordinary Englishmen who could access a variety of means to achieve economic competency, including cultivation of land and involvement in politics, the market was the singular avenue to affluence for the Jewish merchant, and cultivating consumers was the appropriate modus vivendi for the achievement of success. As Joseph Addison remarked in 1712, Jews are indeed so disseminated through all of the trading parts of the world that they are become the instruments by which, listen, mankind are knit together in a general correspondence. They are like the pegs and nails in a great building, which though they are but little valued in themselves, are absolutely necessary to keep the whole frame together. Talking about the commerce, right? Commerce. So I do want to say that they're trying to make it seem like, oh no, Jews never had land, but you guys remember there was already crypto people living as secret Jews. They were so-called English. They did have naturalization. That nobody knew they were Jews. They were hiding. They had converted to Christianity and all that. They weren't practicing Jews like the ones they're talking about here. You understand? So it doesn't mean that they were only on the outside. They were colonizing too in many forms. Although Jewish merchants arrived at different points in the settlement process of each colony, by 1750, there were at least a few Jewish merchants in nearly every British American port town, and many of the market towns who, by virtue of their connections to Jewish merchants in other British American colonies, all right, because of their connections worldwide, guys, contributed actively to the vitality of the expanding market of goods for genteel American consumers, though small in number and oh, well, sorry. I don't know what happened there. Hold on. I guess we're almost done in this book at least. But we're not done today. Hold on. So, though small in number and outsiders to British society, they were nevertheless, as Addison stated, pegs in the frame of a wider British market economy on the Atlantic's western edge. All right. So basically, guys, like what I'm trying to say, they're trying to show you, Sephardic Jews had a big role in this whole British Atlantic trade and commerce and culture. Remember who these so-called pirates are, privateers, all these merchants, all that. This is what we've been always learning. We just get in a different way from somebody else, right? In her own, shout out to the author of this, all right? So we've reached the end of this book. I told you we're going to get into another book right now real quick for the dismount, all right? Again, this book was The Atlantic Diaspora, Jews, Conversos, and Crypto Jews in the Age of Mercantilism, 1500 to 1800. Okay. So real quick, we are moving on to this book. Go to my Google Play books. I purchased this right here. Also, I'll have a copy soon on Patreon. And we've been reading, along with this other book, we've been reading The Atlantic Diaspora. We've been also reading this as Dismount a little bit, right? Because they're smaller chapters. So this book is The Jewish Nation of the Caribbean. So who specifically are we talking about? The Spanish-Portuguese Jewish settlements, right? So people of color in the Caribbean and the Guianas, all right? So we've been reading this, remember, and all the other parts too. Today, we'll be reading about the settlements in Pomeroon, all right? Oh, sorry, guys. Let me just get the view. All right. Appreciate your patience. Hope you've been enjoying so far the reading, following along or doing your things while you're listening to me read. You can do so much while I read, take advantage. Take advantage. All right, let's see if we can do this. So we're going to read Pomeroon, right? Okay. So it says, in what is today the Republic of Guiana, on the northern coast of South America was the colony of British Guiana. This part of the wild coast in the 17th century was in Dutch hands, so-called Dutch, right? Who's in Amsterdam at this time? The Sephardic Jews and Moorish people there, the crypto, they're up there running Amsterdam, guys, Netherlands. They are the so-called Dutch. A lot of these, especially the ones coming in ships. It consisted of 3 colonies, Berbice, Demerara, and Essequibo. Essequibo is a large tract of land located between the Essequibo River in the east of the Orinoco River and Venezuela in the west. The exact border is the subject of dispute between Venezuela and Guyana. The Pomeroon region, sometimes called Pauroma, is a part of the Essequibo colony between the Pomeroon River and the Orinoco. So we have gone over, their settlements in Pomeroon, right, in Guyana. Now, what does this remind me, right? What does this remind me? This is what I was trying to tell you, so-called Dutch. What? Let me just say one thing, right? Van Sertima. Van Sertima. Van Sertima. Ivan Van Sertima, right? Pan-African, right? We've been talking about lately, right? Where's he from? He's from Guyana, guys. He has this ancestry. This is his ancestors. We're going to be reading of Ivan Van Sertima's ancestors, the ones that are not Indian, right? The ones that are not Indian. But when I did his genealogy, it looked like a lot of these people. All right, go check out the video. We kind of showed a little bit what I'm talking about. So this is the region we're talking about, right? So it says in the 17th century, beside the interests of Dutch in settling the wild coast in order to cultivate tropical produce, the proximity to Spanish-held America could be beneficial to promoting trade with the Spanish colonies, legal or illicit. The Dutch had made several attempts at settling parts of the Venezuelan coast and establishing commercial outposts. However, owing to Spanish resistance, they mean Catholic. It's not Spanish versus Dutch here, guys. Remember that. They mean the Catholic Spanish, because a lot of these so-called Dutch are Spanish. This is the context they leave out of these things, but we already know this, right? Right, guys? We already know this. A lot of these so-called Dutch are ex-Sephardic Jews, ex-more coming from Spain and Portugal. So it's more of them beefing with the Catholics. That's the so-called Spanish resistance. These attempts were unsuccessful and had to be terminated, right? After short and sometimes longer periods of time. One of the centers of competition between the Dutch and the Spanish were the salt deposits of Araya. Salt was a very important commodity in the first American colonies. We're talking about commodities again, right? I bet you Lopez brothers had access to this because of their Sephardic Jewish brethren in over here in Guyana. This is what they were talking about. Their connections. They made sure to deal only with themselves, guys. They had a monopoly on this. The Dutch were defeated there in 1622, and had tried unsuccessfully to return several times. In 1628, there was a Dutch attempt to settle in Matanzas, and in 1629 on the Orinoco. So when they say these Dutch, they mean the cryptos, right? Representing so-called Dutch against the Catholics. Simultaneously to all of these efforts, the Dutch traders established a depot for goods on the Pomeroon River and built a fort named New Zealand. In 1613, the Netherlander Jules van der Hoes van Sertima, who established a colony on the Essequibo River called Nova Zelandia and founded a fort with the descriptive name Kik over al, look over all, which was located on the strategic hillside overlooking the traffic of 3 rivers, Essequibo, Masoroni, and Cayoni. By 1648, attempts were made to strengthen and revive a settlement on the Pomeroon. So this is the next page, guys. So they're showing like a map here, right, of where they're settling in Guyana, map of the Mara and the Essequibo prepared by Jacques Nicole Belling, right? And this is the map. So on the Essequibo rivers where they're settling, right, efforts were not crowned with success. The loss of the Dutch possessions in Brazil in 1654 led to a crisis in the Dutch West India Company. All right, so look, because the Sephardic Jews lost possession, what happened? The Dutch West India Company also lost because it's the same people. Who owns the Dutch? Who were the chairmen? We've gone over this, guys. We've shown a lot of them were Sephardic Jews, people of color, yeah. And it found it difficult to assist its colonies in the Wild Coast. There was pressure within the company to abandon the Essequibo settlements. The chambers of the cities Middelburg, Vlissingen, and Ver decided to combine forces in order to support the colony and to raise sufficient funds to support settlement in the Essequibo and Pomeroon regions. On 24th of December 1657, an agreement was signed between the burgomasters of Middelburg, Vlissingen, and Veer on the one side and the West India Company on the other, defining the rules and regulations of the colony. Adriansen van Cromwell was a trader and sea captain who had reached the wild coast with 3 ships sailing from Zealand in 1660. He had served and traded with Spaniards. With who? With Spaniards. Crypto, same people, right? Dealt with the Indians and negotiated with the English in Barbados. What English? You mean like English like Aaron Lopez and Carvajal, who wasn't English? We just read this, right? This experienced trader was nominated Commodore of Essequibo to be governed from Fort Chicoveral. His deputy Cornelius Goliath was to govern the Pomeroon region. As the mouth of the Essequibo River was difficult for ships navigating from the Atlantic, and since the land around the fort was not very suitable for agricultural development, Pomeroon was chosen as the site of the new settlement. Through the mouth of the Pomeroon River, large ships could enter into the interior of the country. Its land was more suitable for plantations, and its location was nearer Spanish America. Parallel to this effort were made to mobilize suitable settlers who would be of benefit for the colony. Preference and priority was given to those, listen, Portuguese Jews. Preference and priority, when we talk about settlers, right? Why are the Dutch giving priority to Portuguese Jews, so-called Dutch? This is what I'm trying to tell you guys. They try to explain these in these books, but they're leaving out so much context. So preference and priority was given to those Portuguese Jews. Portuguese Jews in contemporary accounts were known to be very, very dark-skinned people, very dark-skinned people from these times. We've proven it. We've shown the primary sources. Talking about black folks. They get the priority, these Portuguese Jews who had fled Dutch Brazil. Why did they flee Dutch Brazil? Because the Catholic, so-called Spanish, came into town and kicked them out. The same people who were kicked out and ended up in Amsterdam, we just read in the other book, right? The refugees coming from Arrecife, Brazil. Same thing. Some went to Amsterdam, some went to Pomeroon, some went to other places. These ones right here went to Pomeroon. They had fled Dutch Brazil and had experience in the region and its conditions. They had specialized in growing sugar cane, as well as refining sugar, and were also considered experts in several kinds of tropical produce. Moreover, Spanish-Portuguese Jews had a facility for languages, which allowed for commerce with the Spanish colonies in America. It was also an accepted fact that the merchants in Spanish America were in many cases people living there as Marranos. I told you I ain't making this up. And in some instances were related to Jews settling in the Dutch American colonies, like I said. In Spanish America were what? Were what? What? Spanish and so-called Spanish, so-called Dutch were actually what? Related, because they all Sephardic Jews, crypto Jews. That's what I'm trying to explain to you, all right? See, we get the drop here and there, little by little, here and there, here and there. Hopefully it starts making sense to you. and the cognitive dissonance doesn't hit you. Fleeing. What you mean fleeing? Yeah, getting kicked out. You got to understand what do you mean? Are we sure? We read the primary sources, first-hand accounts of the people themselves, Guiana spies. What are you referring to, man? Are we sure? What do you mean? No, I'm not. I'm not just here guessing. I'm telling you from my research. The Catholics were murdering these people. Do you understand that? So a lot of them fled. A lot of them got relocated by force. Some stayed and pretended to be Christians. As secret Jews, lived secret lives. Different cases. In Amsterdam, the influential Jewish refugees from Brazil, all right, from Brazil in Amsterdam. Listen, David Nazi, we got him on so many videos. Even in the last video that the last book we just came from, we, we read a chapter on him. Was contacted, an arrangement concluded with him to transport Jews from the Netherlands, Sephardic Jews in general. Who's in the Netherlands, guys? The same people who had fled the Inquisition from Spain and Portugal, who had gone to Holland, created the New Jerusalem in Amsterdam. These same people eventually were transported to settle them on the wild coast. We're talking about South America, and to provide them with free land and slaves from Africa. Dodge the hijack. Where's the proof for that Africa part? We already debunked that. They were using the local labor and their own undesirable Europeans, as indentured servants, and other slaves from England and all these other places. But in general, they used the Indians. We've proven this, especially in South America, in this area, what they were doing to the Indian people, enslaving them in large numbers. We already debunked that Africa stuff. If you're still on that, then you must be new and you don't know real history. So providing them with servants and sugarcane fields, which would be obtained on credit. At a later stage, David Nassi was accused of some Jews settling in Pomeroon of losing interest in the colony and taking better care of the Jewish settlement of Remire on the Canyon Island, where he was nominated patron, patroon, right, boss, plantation, the master of the settlement, and where he himself settled. As in other Dutch possessions, settlers were discouraged from taking servants with them, and the company reserved its right to supply the slaves. In the case of Pomeroon, if the settler purchased 2 slaves in cash, credit could be given for another 2. The Dutch quest for Spanish-speaking Jews had reached countries outside the Netherlands. In the state papers of the British Secretary of State, John Turlough, there is a 1657 report from Leghorn, written by the British agent there, Charles Longlang, in which we find it seems that the states of Holland are making a plantation between Suriname and Cartagena in the West Indies, wherein they go very wisely and politically to work, aiming chiefly at a trade there with the Spaniard, for which purpose they have sent hither to invite many families of Jews and granted them many privileges and immunities. Spanish has become now the Jews' mother tongue, not only in these parts but throughout the Turkish dominions, in which respect they will be very useful to the Dutch in their plantations, and many opportunities may present them to converse with the Spaniard, for which purpose they were sending thither 25 families of Jews. So, again, so-called Dutch, the same people. And this is what I'm saying. So this so-called Dutch includes Huguenots, right? So aren't Huguenots supposed to be French? So now they're Dutch too? Like, this is what I'm saying. When you start looking into these people's name and who they are, who they talking about specifically, you see what I'm talking about, right? Let me just read the chat real quick, guys. Hold on. Oh no, what's going on here? See, Guyana spies. Hey guys, don't erase messages if people are not being disrespectful. Guyana spies, we're not gonna like argue in the chat right now, right? Like, you just talking in the chat, I've shown sources. That's the difference. Know the difference, Guyana spies. Know the difference. You're talking about personal, emotional stuff, and you're probably mixing up modern day Jews, Ashkenazi, with who we talking about here, Sephardic Jews, colonial times, people of color. So please don't interrupt the chat anymore with your you're not we're live right now. If you like to make a video about what you're saying and show some sources and whatever you want to show, go ahead and feel free to. Thank you. The years 60, see, you're probably from Guyana. Now you're getting all like the chill. The year 1657, the purpose of the colony and the need of Jewish settlers from Leghorn, who were mostly Spanish speaking. See chapters on Cayenne and Tobago, which we already read in this book and the previous parts. Shows us without any doubt that the colony mentioned by the British agent and Leghorn should have been Pomeroon. This is also confirmed the proceedings of the Committee for the three Western cities, Middleburn, Flushing, and Veer in the colony of Nova Zelandia, 1658 to 1663, where we see deliberations on transporting Leghorn Jews to Pomeroon. Yeah. Hey, no, hey, Red Lion, you're good. We're not talking to you, bro. J9 or me are not talking to you. We're talking to Guiana Spice 52. You're talking about random stuff, man. Please stop babbling. I'm gonna have to time you out. I'm with you on all the things, but Spain sending militias one thing, they still need people. What are you talking about? You're talking about random things. We also see the Paulo Jacobo Pinto acting on behalf of Jewish colonists, dealing mainly with Leghorn Jews, handling numerous applications. About Paulo Jacobo Pinto, again, I'm talking about people of color here, guys. We're talking about a history that never gets talked about. That's why people get all touchy and emotional about it. Because they can't fathom that the slave plantation owner, the people are people of color, and just, you might even want to fathom that these might be your relatives, some of your ancestors too. Yeah, people fled things. People were fleeing. These people were persecuted too by the Catholics. Yes, that's been happening for many years. How do we know? Because we read the primary sources. Is what I'm trying to tell you. I don't just say things. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else got anything to say in the chat? What's up? Because that's why we do this live sometimes, so we can address certain things if you have especially, right? All these people, Pinto, these are all people of color. Pinto, Felipe de Fuentes, Portuguese, a refugee from Brazil, acted on behalf of his fellow refugees to arrange for their settlement in Pomeroon, and 4 or 5 ships with many Jews went thither. If we follow the different accounts of ships sailing to Pomeroon, this seems to be the right number. On 2nd February 1658, the first ship carrying Jews, the Guyanas, left Flushing. On 12th of May 1658, the E. Endrat, also known as Concordia, sailed from Middleburg to Pomeroon. Look where they're coming from. This journey is described thoroughly in the narratives of Joshua Nunez Neto and Joseph Pereira. Pereira is a derivative of Perry. A lot of Pereiras became Perry. Written in September 1657 in Pomeroon. It was published by the eminent Surinamese Jewish historian Jaap Mayer, based on the material compiled in the archives of the Portuguese Jewish community in The Hague. In the narrative, they describe that they have left Middleburg on 12th of May, that the ship carried not only Jewish passengers, but who else? But also French. Who's these French? Usually French Huguenots. Come on now. I can't make this up, guys. They're all together. Everything's happening. Same things are happening because they're all the same people. Who are the Huguenots? Ex-Sephardic Jews, ex-Moorish Muslims who fled Spain and Portugal, settled in Lower France, and became known as the Huguenots. That's why they also invited. And a lot of the Huguenots also were the so-called Dutch, bringing them. That's why I'm trying to tell you why Dutch so hesitant on bringing so-called Jews and Huguenots over to settle their territory, so-called Dutch. Who's running Holland at that time. Catch up on the videos. All right, that's it. That's it. I told you, man. But Dutch traders are blah, blah, blah. I'm not here to answer your questions. I'm reading a book live. You got my contact info. Send me the sources. Set up a call with me on Zoom if you want to talk about this, man. Do your own videos. Go open your own channel if you don't agree with something. So they bring in French Huguenots too, huh? Huguenots, who preferred to live under the rule of Protestant Netherlands. Why would they prefer Protestants than Catholics, huh? You got to understand the deepness behind that. Most Huguenots, a lot of Huguenots are ex-Moors, That's why they'd rather live in Protestant countries. The leaders of the Jewish passengers were Messrs. David Vaz and Eliza Abbas, and although descendants of conversos, they were very religious. Two examples prove this point. Due to the errors of navigation, the ship suffered a lack of water, which even endangered the life of the passengers in mid-Atlantic. Neto and Pereira describe the situation as follows. On this day, the eve of Tisaba, 10 o'clock at night, 7 August, eve of the start of the fast of the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Ab, commemorating the two destructions of the Temple of Jerusalem and the date of the edict of expulsion of the Jews from Castile. It rained heavily, and with the aid of sheets we gathered much water, which we saved until the next evening, the end of the fast. We thought it better to gather the water, but not to drink of it, due to the fast, just like the Supreme Being had shown to Moses the promised land, but had pointed out to him that he should not enter it. So this was translated from Portuguese, okay? The other instance occurred when the Concordia reached the Pomeroon settlement. That day was Sabbath. All the French and Dutch passengers, together with their chests, beds, and luggage, disembarked. Oh, this is a little map they're showing. 3 big boats, 1 from the ship and 2 from Pomeroon. After the 2 boats had left, the captain wanted all the Jews to disembark, which we refused to do because it was the Sabbath, and told him the boat would have to wait until night when we would board it. Wow. He's like, hey, it's Sabbath. Hey, don't interrupt us, man. About 5 September 1658, the Prince Willem sailed from Flushing for the wild coast with colonists. There is also reference to a ship from Sale, Morocco, to carry Jews to the new colony. This is very probable. Sale had a strong Jewish community, which kept in contact with other Sephardic Jews communities. I told you, talking about Sephardic people. We ain't talking about Ashkenazi right now. The advent of the false Messiah Shabbatai Sevite stirred strong expectations in Sale. In some instances, they reached a feverish pitch. Chief Rabbi Jacob Sasportas fought a futile battle against the movement caused by Shabbatai Sevi's pretensions. The Jews of Sale expected speedy redemption, expressed their feeling in an arrogant and untypical for Jewish behavior in Morocco, noisy public manner. This brought upon them the anger of the governor of Sale and the local populace, who initiated a series of anti-Jewish measures and persecutions, forcing many Sale Jews to emigrate. As many of these Jews were of Spanish and Portuguese origin. All right, they're of what? Spanish and Portuguese origin. They probably found a solution by trying to settle in the Dutch colonies in America. Why? What do you mean probably? These are the same people. They're related to the so-called Dutch who are Sephardic too. That's why you don't know. They leave a lot of context out, these authors, right? These modern authors. But shout out to the author for sharing the book, right? There's also a reference to Portuguese Jews from Hamburg, right? We're talking about Germany, or was that Switzerland? Where is that? Hamburg, I forget. That Germany. So Jews from there, Sephardic Jews from there, joining their brethren. Again, joining who? Their brethren from the Netherlands. so-called Dutch, right, in the colonizing venture in the Pomeroon, colonizing so-called Black Europeans, right, so-called colonizing, right. A rare instance as far as Jewish settlement in America is concerned is the case of the Jew from Brazil, Felipe de Fuentes, who equipped his own ship and with a group of Jews arrived in Pomeroon in 1660 on board the Argon. In their proceeding of the Committee for the Governing of the three Walcheren cities, Middelburg, Flushing, and Veer, the colony of Nova Zelandia, 1658, 1663, you find a resolution of 10th of June 1660. It was also resolved to use this opportunity to send in the ship which Don Felipe de Fuentes is getting ready 2,000 pounds of meat, 3,000 pounds of lard, along with some flour and 3 vats of oil, and a chest of old linen and some medicines for the use of the new colony. And this was translated from the Dutch. Iberian Peninsula was and still is Spain, Portugal, like they include parts of Morocco, northern, like a lot, you know, Iberian Peninsula, Iberia, yes. Initially, Iberia was that down there, yes. Still is. Mr. Nicholas Clement, sorry. And on August 20, 1660, there was a resolution saying, Mr. Nicholas Clement reports that the two deputies from Nova Zelandia have been sent to their principals and are ready to depart with Don Felipe de Fuentes' ship, whereupon it was resolved to examine the same in order to determine what shall be necessary in order to send along with the ship Argon going there. All right. We have mentioned that in the interest of settling Essequibo and Pomeroon, or again, this is in Guiana, guys, many attractive financial conditions and purchases on credit were given to the new settlers. Moreover, an effort was made to grant rights and privileges to the Jews settling there. There was, however, no intention of having an exclusively Jewish settlement there, as was the case in Remire, on the island of Cayenne, or to have a region settled by Jews, as in the Jewish Savannah in Suriname. All right, all Sephardic, I'm telling you, before the 1800s, guys, in general, these were Sephardic Jewish people. The British historian Lucian Wolff found in the Egerton collection in the British Museum a document entitled Privileges Granted to the People of the Hebrew Nation, that are to go to the wild coast, This document was the object of research and discussion among historians until it was finally established that it is a translation from a Dutch text from 1657. The probable explanation is that the document was sent to Leghorn in order to show the Jews their privileges in the new colony and was sent to England by Longland together with his report. It is logical that this could have served as a basis for the British in their grant of privileges by the Governor, Council, and Assembly of Suriname to the Jews in Suriname, dated 17th of August, 1665. See chapter on Suriname. I think we've read that already. If not, we probably will. But we have read of the Jews that have gone, the crypto Jews that have gone to Suriname, like in other videos and from other books. The Portuguese version of the document was found by Dr. Robert Cohen. Robert Cohen, in this document we find. So he says, liberty of conscience is granted with the exercise of laws and ceremonies according to the doctrines of their ancients, and to have synagogues, schools, and burial ground according to their fashion. Sabbath and holy days will be observed, and they, the Jews, shall not be obliged to appear in court, nor have guard duty except if God forbid it should be of urgent necessity. The Hebrews shall be admitted as burgesses of Sealand. All right, that's in Guiana. But now they're the middle class. They're part of their subjects now. They're allowed to be subjects or so-called citizens. Right? Why? They are creating a haven for the persecuted people from the Catholics. They were doing this. They were establishing themselves while they were fleeing the Catholics. This did happen. No matter who they enslaved on the way or took over, what land they took over on the way or mixed with on the way. Yeah, Indians, yeah. In that same year, 1657, the Jews who were to settle in Pomeroon received 21 December, a holy Torah scroll from the Amsterdam Jewish community. who were, again, Sephardic Jews. They took over Amsterdam, guys. Look it up. We've done the research. We've shown it in several videos. And whose archives they received was found, signed by David Castiel de la Mota. Right, he's the Dutch. I told you, de la Mota. Ya tú sabes, mi nene, tú sabes. Pura vida, mi gente. David de la Mota. And Daniel Cardoso y José Pereira. All right. I'm telling you, these are your so-called people in Amsterdam. That's your Amsterdam Jewish community. Look at their names. Among other things we find written in the receipt, we obligate ourselves. God bring us in peace to Iquique, coast of the American Indies, whether we are going to deliver it to the holy congregation, with which God's help shall be founded. We can assume from the above that the scroll of the law and Torah and the signature of the name of the holy congregation to be established demonstrates the intention of founding a synagogue in Pomeroon. Moreover, in the proceedings of the Committee of the Three Cities, Resolution Raken de Nue Colony and Isekepe, Esequibo, from 15 November 1657, there is a request by the Hebrew nation with a promise that it would be executed under the heading liberties which are requested of the Hebrew nation for the colonization of the wild coast. Article 8 states that the customs and constitutions which the Portuguese Jewish nation shall ordain among themselves shall be required to be observed and followed by all Jews who shall come to live upon the aforesaid coast. Okay? This shows the precedence the Portuguese Jews gave to their customs compared to Jews from other origins. This is also the case in the request of the Curaçao Jewish community, just like in Curaçao. Same thing, guys. Who? Portuguese Jews, Spanish. Requests of the which financially helped the synagogues, Jeshuat Israel in Newport, Rhode Island, and Sharif Israel in New York. Among the conditions for receiving this aid was one that the Spanish Portuguese Jewish way of prayer prevail in the synagogues, not the Ashkenazi way. That's literally what they mean, guys. Article 9 states that no demand shall be made for any debts incurred in Brazil or other cities. Oh, what happened here? Oh, okay, I get it. My fault. Okay, what happened? Hold on. Where were we, guys? Where were we? Okay. And it's not gonna stay occurred in Brazil. Kingdoms had the problem their kind. This made it easier using from Brazil were still burned. Man, where were we? I know we were here. Okay, this is also, yep, in Curaçao. Yes, sir, okay. Article 9 states that no demand shall be made for any debts incurred in Brazil or other cities or kingdoms except in these provinces or there in the colony. This made it easier for the Jewish refugee from Brazil who were still burdened with debts incurred there to choose to reside in Pomeroon. It also assumed that, this article protects the Jews from debts incurred by judgment of the tribunals of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, including the one in Cartagena, which confiscated goods belonging to Dutch Jews. The very scant information on everyday life in the Pomeroon settlement does not provide any details on the existence of a synagogue there. As mentioned earlier, the Dutch companies reserved the right in the settlements they managed to supply the slaves from Africa, thus the hijack from America and Europe, and stipulated in a rule as to in what manner and conditions the Negroes shall be delivered in the wild coast. The Negroes, huh? Just like they were calling Indians of South America Negroes of the land, right? So what Negroes are you talking about? This is what I'm saying. That's your hijack. In the document found by Lucien Wolf. I bet you that document don't say nothing about Africa. It says Negroes. Delivery of the slaves is vividly described by the narrative by Neto and Pereira, in which they tell that on arrival on the coast of America, A ship dropped anchor alongside us, the ship which had gone to Guinea to get the Negroes. Guiana, Guinea? You mean, or you mean Cape Verde? Or where exactly you mean? Show me the source. The commander and someone who did the buying came on board and informed us that they had 300 artas, apparently meaning the Guinea tribe of Artras. Yeah, sure. Okay, we're gonna definitely follow up on that, guys. Remember that if you want to follow up, if you want to debunk me, right? Here's the footnote 20. You saw what chapter we're on, right? We're gonna follow up on that. There has been some There has been some speculation as to exactly where the Jews had settled, but from all the descriptions available, it is quite easy to conclude that the settlement was on the bank of the Pomeroon River called New Middleburg, beside the fort called New Zealand. Neto and Pereira describe it in their narrative, saying the commander and the former governor of the settlement informed us that the settlement lay on the Pauroma, Pomeroon River, and it is interesting to follow their impressions on landing. The country is covered by forest that is not too dense, and there are some Indian villages upstream. The Indians are very Gentile and peace loving. You see? You see what happened? So, because they were Gentile and peace loving, you took advantage. There was a Jew in a boat with Indians, and I spoke to one who could speak Spanish very well. In a word, the country is as I had always dreamed it to be. There were no snakes and no mosquitoes, few or no ants. The plantations were excellent and the most fertile on which all plants could be cultivated. All plants, cultivated. The same enthusiasm was shared by Felipe de Fuentes, who had arrived with another group of Jews on his own ship. In a letter from 20 November 1660, written in New Middleburg, he says, I consider this land better than Brazil, but in order to become acquainted with its virtue, one has need of a quality of Negroes, servants, and particularly a governor with 25 soldiers in order to keep the land quiet. The crops are getting on very well. And in April 1661, he writes, at present, everything is progressing favorably. Provisions are in abundance. The ground not only promises, but yields richly. The country is at a present full of sugar cane, so that we have very great need of sugar boilers. So, if you're new to my channel and you're confused if these people were calling other people Negroes, remember Negroes eventually many times was literally the same as slave, right? That's what they're talking about. Negro could be Indians, could be Black Europeans, could be many things. Don't forget the research we've done. And doesn't mean Black folks wouldn't use that term. Do you guys not use that term if you're so-called Black today? Mr. N. Darnell Davis writes in an article appearing in Agricultural Magazine from the Merada on the beginning of Guiana. It would appear that it was to the Jews that Essequibo owed the introduction of cane cultivation after the Sealing Company had leased Guiana from the West India Company. They took steps to induce private persons to come and settle Essequibo on their own account. Many of the newcomers were Jews who had been in Brazil. Because of them, small plantations were cleared and planted with canes. The description given by Major John Scott, published by B.T. Harlow, also sees the Pomeroon colony as a success. He places the colony between the Pomeroon and Moruca rivers and says a great colony of Dutch and Jews drawn off Brazil by the Portuguese settled there and being experienced planters soon grew a flourishing company. Yet not everything went smoothly, and there were several protests by Jewish settlers to the Committee of the Three Cities, Middleburg, Flushing, and Weert, governing Pomeroon. They complained that there is not sufficient interest in the colony. The 9 September 1660 resolution states that Moses Neto had appeared in the name of his brother-in-law and the Jewish nation, asking whether the committee is willing to keep up the colony, otherwise the settlers were to depart from there, leaving it abandoned. Again, on the 21st of May, 1660, a Jew named Latorre came to Amsterdam, leaving his wife and children in Pomeroon in order to request the return of some of 40 souls from the colony as well as the return of the company of the slaves they had received from them. Hmm. On January 6, 1661, an explanation is given for why some Jews on their way to Pomeroon were detoured to Tobago, since it was not possible to transport these people to Pomeroon because there was a great mortality and weakness in Nova Zelandia. The initial crisis and difficulties notwithstanding, the colony met with success. Sugar from New Middleburg was already offered in Middleburg on 6th of June 1661, and on 23rd of January 1661, 60 to 70,000 pounds of sugar arrived from Pomeroon in Amsterdam. Gradually, the Pomeroon colony became by far more important than its principal in Fort Kicovero on the Essequibo. The Portuguese Jews from Brazil developed their plantations and erected several sugar plants. By 1665, the production and development of the Pomeroon colony was rapidly increasing. The Dutch commander of Pomeroon, Francois de Figne, was given supreme control of the colony and was not dependent anymore on Kicovero, as had been the case with his predecessor, Cornelius Goliath. During its existence, the mostly Jewish, or its existence, right, the mostly Jewish colony of Pomeroon was considered one of the most important of the first Jewish settlements in America. Guiana, where Ivan Van Sertima was from. Ivan Van Sertima, Pan-African, right? General Byam, the British commander prominent in Suriname history, describes it in his journal. But the greatest of all the Dutch ever had in America was Barum, Paruma or Pomeroon, and Moruco, alias New Zealand, a most flourishing colony, 16 leagues leeward of Essequibo. So you guys see, if you ever see some old pictures of some indigenous people and you see the word New Zealand, don't assume it's the one over there next to Australia, because literally, I'm talking about spelled like this. It might be pictures of Indians from America. This colony they called New Zealand in Guiana. Despite all the fame and success of the Pomeroon settlement, details of it are very sketchy, maybe owing to its having been so short-lived. Some 8 or 9 years, and to the lack of sufficient archives. The fact is that even the exact number of settlers is not clear. They don't want you to know how many of these colored folk from Europe came. They don't want you to know that. In a report by Spanish scouts sent on a reconnaissance mission in 1663, cited by Professor George Burr, who estimated that the Pomeroon and Moruca settlements had over 1,000 Dutch settlers, which included the Jews, estimated about 50 to 60 families, and 400 wealthy Indians who had been expelled from Brazil. Wealthy Indians, how do they become wealthy? Are they fully Indians? And what do you mean? Interesting, huh? They were expelled from Brazil. We have seen already in the chapter on Martinique that Indians from Brazil joined the Jews from Brazil as free men. Listen. And also a greater number of, dodge the hijack. They just adding that because they were black folks. They have to add that. They're trying to explain the color. These people, when you start looking at them, they were known to be Negroid people they're talking about. These free men, these Indians and these Brazilians. What African slaves? Show me that they're from Africa. So again, who's these Sephardic people mixing with and dealing with? Indians. Everyday life in Pomeroon, including the Jewish life, is hard to trace. So the letter by Commander de Figne, dated 3 March 1663, gives us a rare glimpse into internal relations in the colony as follows. I am here in the midst of a heap of unruly, wanton, and reckless people, excepting always the pious, and who are few in number, both among the Christians and the Jews, and importuned by them all from morning until night, so that I cannot remain at a table in peace. The stepfather of a Jew named Isaac de Fonseca, ya tú sabes, mi gente, came to me weeping and complaining that he had been beaten by him, and that he had called his mother a whore. Whoa, which I could not allow to pass before God in the law. Wherefore I had the aforementioned Jew, Fonseca, summoned to render an account of what he had done, and if the mother were guilty, to duly punish her and to deal with him as a godless person who had despised his parents. The fellow being wanton and insolent and unwilling to admit his fault, I had him placed in irons. The Jews took his amiss, and Isaac Enriquez More, Enriquez More, putting himself somewhat forward, I had him placed with the other because he wished to leave the country at once, and by this means I was obliged to make sure of his person and the debt he owed, your honors, since I was compelled to quiet the people here. The somewhat tumultuous Hebrew nation, having become aware that the two Jews would be kept in prison until my return from Moruca, began to cast sour looks at me. And the principal one among them, Felipe de Fuentes, began to say that the planters would rise, thinking perhaps to feel my pulse and to intimidate me by such threats. I called the soldier to arms in order to have the prisoner executed. I wished to show them that threats only made me more resolute. On my return from Moruca, Moruca, that's in South America, guys. Amoruca, right? Just put an A right there, Amoruca. I examined the matter, and being influenced by much entreaty and prayer, I liberated him with the others. The success of the Pomeroon colony was of short duration. The British holding Suriname were anxious to eliminate the neighboring Dutch colonies and started to attack them in force. General Byam's journal describes how, in December 1665, Major John Scott, commissioned by His Excellency Francis Lord Willoughby of Parham, with a small fleet and upward of 300 men, took the Dutch fort and colony of Baruma or Pomeroon, and also the fort of Diskebi or Essequibo. One view holds that Scott destroyed the fort and plundered and burned the house of the inhabitants. His own statements places things in a different slant and claims he had left the occupied Dutch colonial garrison for the use of England and had tried to induce Lord Willoughby to strengthen the colonies so that they should be a stronghold in those parts. The British failed to the British failed to occupy Berbice, where, all right, there you left off, where the Dutch commander Bergenar successfully resisted them in Fort Nassau. Moreover, he also managed, with the help of the Indians, to recapture Fort Kickovero, where the English garrison surrendered hungry and lacking ammunition. The starving British garrison at Fort Nova Zelandia and the Pomeroon settlement surrendered and was recaptured by the Dutch, but remained an isolated Dutch outpost to be destroyed later by French privateers, pirates. Huh? So again, this is all like literally crypto talk, secret talk. It's when I mean countries fighting each other and all that, guys. They're not really talking about countries. They're like the Catholics and the other people. So whoever's representing Catholic, they could be from the same country. The people they're fighting could be from the same country, guys. This one's Catholic, one's Christian. So by the end of 1666, the states of Sealand sent out a fleet of 7 vessels and 1,000 men under Abraham Crimson to recapture the forfeited Dutch colonies and to attack British Suriname. With the exception of Cayenne and the Wild Coast became Dutch. Garrisons were sent to Essequibo and Suriname. Pomeroon, however, was abandoned. The British explorer H. Bolingbroke described his visit to Pomeroon in 1809. Up the edges of this river, the melancholy traces of ancient cultivation and abandoned residences, listen, are frequently apparent. He's writing this in 1809. Ancient cultivation, right? Agriculture. That's the start of civilizations, guys. Ancient. Above the fork formed by the junction of the Harlipiak with the Pomeroon, the Hollanders had formerly 3 settlements of some extent. Fort Sealand, which the English destroyed in 1666, New Middleburg, which at the same time was plundered and abandoned, and Harlipiak. All right, 1 second, guys, real quick. Hold on. Just want to see something real quick. Trying to see something real quick here. Hold on. Okay. Sorry. What happened to the Jews of Pomeroon after the British attack and the destruction of their homes, plantations, and mill? This remains a mystery and the object of research which has yet has produced no results. James Rodway, the historian of British Guiana, says that the Dutch colonies on the wild coast were in disastrous state. Pomeroon destroyed, Cayenne devastated, and newly captured Suriname ruined. The Dutch had hopes of Suriname. The plantations were ruined, very few English remained, and many of the slaves left behind, rather than submit to their new masters, retreated to the jungle, where they formed tribes of the so-called, listen, bush Negroes. Now they're the bush Negroes. Now they're trying to say that's why the people that are indigenous or tribes in the jungles of South America are bush Negroes because what? Because slaves from Africa supposedly went? Yeah, see, that's the hijack. Yeah, those bush Negroes are indigenous people and the black Europeans that escaped. Yeah. Every possible inducement was offered by the Dutch to obtain new settlers for Suriname. As a result, a few of the ruined Jews from Pomeroon came first, and a fair number of Huguenots. Samuel Oppenheim is of the same opinion that at least part of the Jews of Pomeroon had left for Suriname. Strangely enough, the historical work by the leaders of the Suriname Jews Historical Essay on the Colony of Suriname, 1788, does not mention Pomeroon Jews, while at the same time, probably says, it goes into detail into the arrival of Jews from Cayenne 3 to 4 years earlier. We could also refer to the Hanam Rabbi Joseph Korkos of Curaçao, who served there in the 19th century and wrote its history. He tells us of a group of Italian Jews which had left the island of Curaçao in 1693 to settle in Tucacas on the Venezuelan coast facing Curaçao. We have seen in the chapter that the Dutch had several enclaves on the Venezuelan coast in the 17th century. There they formed the Congregation of Santa Irmandad, Holy Brotherhood. Corcos writes that the Jews were Italian and many have come from Leghorn to Cayenne and from there to Curaçao. Most probably, most of the Cayenne Jews went to Suriname, including the ones that joined them from Tobago. And as there was no settlement of Leghorn Jews directly to Curaçao, those that went to Tucacas might have been the refugees from Pomeroon. As to the supposition in Byam's journal, the Jews, Dutch, and French had left for Martinique and Saint Christopher as improbable as seeing that Jews would have settled in French territories, where they already clearly were unwanted. We find among other Jewish families in Saint Christopher, Saint Kitts, the Nunez Neto family, which was quite prominent in Pomeroon. I'm just looking at the chat. Exactly, Emmanuel Jeter. I've been telling you, I don't know if you remember, but I told you when you first came, that's a Huguenot last name. The Jeters are very much Huguenot family, right? There's a theory that Jews from Pomeroon might have gone to Barbados. There's also tenable. The British governor Francis Lord Willoughby was interested in Jewish settlement. We have seen the efforts he made to take the remnants of the Remery Jews to Barbados. As Pomeroon was captured by his officers, they might have taken some Jews. Major Scott returned to Barbados in April 1666. One fact is clear: the Pomeroon Jews dispersed in the region. It seems that some individuals remained in Western Guiana. For some strange reason, the Dutch were reluctant to have Jews settling in the colonies of Berbice and Demerara. Pomeroon was almost completely abandoned, so we find some Jews in Essequibo. Samuel Oppenheim found correspondence between Abraham Beekman, commander of Essequibo, appointed 1678, and the West India Company dated 31st of March, 1684, which is very illustrative of the Jewish role in the Guyanas. Beckman writes, the Jew Solomon de la Roche, having died some 8 or 9 months ago, the trade in vanilla has come to an end, since no one here knows how to prepare it so as to develop the proper aroma and keep it from spoiling. I have not heard of any of this whole year. Little is found here. Most of it is to be found in Pomeroon, whither this Jew frequently traveled, and he used sometimes to make me a present of a little. In navigating along the river too, I have sometimes seen some of the trees and picked with my own hands, and it was prepared by the Jew. Although I was never before acquainted with the virtues and values of this fruit. The Jew has, without my knowledge, secretly sent a deal home. I shall do my best to obtain for the company, in Pomeroon or elsewhere, as much as I shall be feasible. but I am afraid it will spoil, since I do not know how to prepare it. I shall take care that no private business be carried in it. To this letter, Beekman receives a reproof on 21st of August, 1684, as to the vanilla trade, which we recommend you carry on for the company, whereupon you answer us saying that this trade has come to an end through the death 8 months ago of a Jew, Solomon de la Roche, a meager and poor excuse. Vanilla was one of the Jewish specialties, and it seems that the preparation of the extract was kept secret. In the chapter on Martinique, we have seen how a Catholic priest tried to spy on a Jew who, having come from Guyanas, knew how to prepare the extract. You guys hear that? Only the Sephardic Jews had to drop. Well, they obviously got it from the Indians, right? And how to prepare the vanilla extract. In 1689, the French plundered what remained in Pomeroon, and Abraham Beekman was dismissed in 1690. Oppenheim mentions a certain Moses Isaac de Viries, who commanded Indian forces against deserters in 1746 in Essequibo, and Isaac Israel Lorenzo, ya tú sabes, who served as an interpreter of Indian languages for an expedition on the Orinoco, because he spoke Hebrew, right? These further indicate, as noted earlier, that relations between Jews and Indians were usually very friendly. All right. The establishment of the press in British Guiana was due to a Portuguese Jew, Mr. J.C. de la Costa. De la Costa, de la Costa, just like the Costa family, South Carolina, remember? A lawyer in Starbrook, later called Georgetown, capital of British Guiana, who in 1793 petitioned the Court of Policy of Demerara and Essequibo for the exclusive right to establish a printing office and a newspaper. There may have been several other Jews in Guiana, but there are no signs of any communal life nor of any attempt to resuscitate Pomeroon. Something had remained in Jewish customs to have us remember Pomeroon. It is the Pomeroon mouse pie, prepared with chocolate, vanilla extract, and almonds. They said that's the Sephardic Jews who started there, right? All right. So, all right, we've reached the end of this chapter, guys, on so-called Jews and Pomeroon. I wouldn't say that's all the history, but it's very brief too. But at least we got something, right? Again, this was the book, The Jewish Nation of the Caribbean, the Spanish-Portuguese Jewish Settlements in the Caribbean and the Guianas by Mordecai Arbel. Okay. And that's when we reach the end of today's reading, guys. All right. Hope you guys enjoyed it, found it valuable, added to the other research we've done. All right. As you guys can see, this is real history. This is a history that never gets told of so-called black folks. A black history that never gets discussed or wants to be discussed. A lot of people don't want to admit this stuff, They want to be just the Indians. They just want to be the Indians. They don't want to be the Sephardic Jews or the Moors or the crypto Jews or the so-called Dutch or the so-called English or the so-called Portuguese or the so-called Spanish or the so-called French or the so-called Protestants or the so-called Huguenots. Yeah, that was a long read, right? Almost 3 hours. Wow. And I'm glad to be done. Trust me. I'm very glad to be done. Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sticking around all the way to the end. I appreciate you guys. Hope you do find it valuable or it helps. In the future, I'm going to grab all this info and just remix it with, videos and get more specific parts of it. You get what I'm saying? So, but I just like to have this recorded. So in case people don't have access to these books, they can just watch the videos, right? But I appreciate you guys. I'm going to go ahead and go into do my favorite cardio on Wednesdays, which is soccer. I got a little soccer match, friendly, 6-on-6. I do every Wednesday. So I'm going to go do that right now. I hope I'm not too late. But thank you for tuning in, guys. I appreciate you guys. Thanks for being here. Thanks for all the support. Thanks for listening patiently. Thanks for having patience with me. Appreciate it. Sephardic Jews, Moorish crypto Jews were, in general, people of color. We've proven it. All right? We've proven it. I don't care what anybody has to say or think. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawaii.